Picture a single moment of profound choice, a quiet yet monumental turning point in a dark, torch-lit hall somewhere in the Holy Land nearly 900 years ago. A young man stands alone, the scent of old stone and beeswax candles filling the air. He has just left behind everything he has ever known: his family name, his inheritance, his freedom, the familiar landscape of his homeland. All of it is gone, willingly surrendered. Tonight he is not a son, not a lord, not a soldier of fortune. He is an aspirant, standing on the precipice of becoming something entirely new, a figure that would echo through history, one of the very first Templar recruits. His journey, and the journeys of men like him, form one of the most compelling and overlooked narratives of the medieval world, a story not just of conquest, but of a radical, almost unimaginable transformation of the human spirit. This is the story we are about to uncover, the untold chronicles of these oath-bound warriors. We will walk with them from their first, tentative steps into the order, through a selection process so rigorous it was designed to break the prideful and the faint of heart. We will stand beside them during the secret, solemn ceremonies of their initiation night, where they traded their personal identities for a sacred vow and a simple white mantle. We will witness their grueling dual education, where the swing of a sword was as much a spiritual practice as a bowed head in prayer, and where the bonds of brotherhood forged in this crucible became stronger than steel or blood. And we will follow them into the stark reality of their first missions, where faith was tested not in the quiet of a chapel, but in the dust and chaos of a dangerous land. Why, after so many centuries, does the legacy of these first knights still hold such a powerful grip on our imagination? It is because their story speaks directly to a universal, timeless search. In our modern world, where identity can feel fluid and commitments can seem temporary, their absolute dedication to a purpose larger than themselves is both awe-inspiring and deeply challenging. Their oath was not just a set of rules, it was a complete reshaping of a life, a promise that guided every action, every thought, every breath until the very end. This journey into their world is more than a history lesson. It is an exploration of what it means to truly belong, to find a cause worth giving everything for, and to build a legacy not on what you acquire, but on what you are willing to surrender. The foundations of a legendary order were not laid in stone, but in the hearts of these first men. Their chronicles begin now. To truly grasp the monumental choice those first young men made, we have to step back from the torch-lit halls and into the wider world of the early 1100s. This was an era defined by two powerful, often colliding forces: deep, fervent faith and relentless, brutal violence. Just a few decades earlier, the armies of the First Crusade had stormed into the Holy Land, driven by a potent mix of religious zeal, the promise of salvation, and a very earthly desire for land and glory. Against all odds, they had succeeded in capturing Jerusalem, establishing a fragile network of European-style kingdoms on the eastern Mediterranean coast. These were the Crusader states, exotic outposts of Christendom with names like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, but these territories were islands in a hostile sea. They were surrounded by powerful Muslim empires that were determined to reclaim their lands, and the initial Christian fervor was already beginning to wane back in Europe. The reality on the ground was one of constant insecurity, where borders shifted with the seasons and no road was truly safe. Into this volatile and dangerous landscape poured a river of pilgrims. Every year, thousands of devout Christians from across Europe undertook the perilous journey to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. They were merchants, peasants, and minor nobles, all driven by a belief that such a pilgrimage could wash away a lifetime of sin. But the path to salvation was fraught with mortal danger. The routes from the coastal ports like Jaffa up to Jerusalem were narrow, winding through rocky gorges and arid hills that provided perfect ambush points. Bandits and raiders, both opportunistic criminals and organized military bands, preyed upon these vulnerable travelers. A pilgrim was often robbed, kidnapped for ransom, or simply killed and left by the roadside, their devout mission ending in tragedy. The local Crusader authorities, perpetually short of soldiers and funds, struggled to police these vast territories. There was a palpable, desperate need for some form of organized protection, a guardian for the defenseless. It was into this specific problem that a minor French knight named Hugh de Payens and his 8 companions stepped. We don't know exactly what sparked the idea in their minds, but its brilliance was in its radical simplicity. They proposed a brotherhood that would dedicate itself entirely to the safety of pilgrims. This was not, in itself, a completely new concept. Knights often acted as protectors. What was utterly unprecedented was the framework they chose. They would not be mere mercenaries or feudal levies. They would become monks. They vowed to live under a religious rule, embracing a life of absolute poverty, strict chastity, and unwavering obedience, just like the monks in a monastery. Yet they would also remain warriors, skilled in arms and ready for combat. This fusion of the cloister and the cavalry was a conceptual earthquake. For centuries, the Church had wrestled with the morality of violence, often condemning the warlike nobility. Here was a group of fighting men who sought to sanctify their profession, to turn the sword itself into an instrument of God's will. Their promise was not of wealth or lands, but of spiritual purpose. They offered a path for a knight to save his soul not by abandoning his sword, but by wielding it in the service of the faithful. This radical vision was the seed from which the Templars grew. The stage was perfectly set. A desperate practical need met a revolutionary spiritual solution. When Hugh and his small band presented their idea to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem around the year 1119, he saw its potential immediately, granting them quarters on the very site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, which gave them their famous name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. This context is everything. It explains why a man would leave everything behind to join this fledgling order. He wasn't just joining an army, he was enrolling in a spiritual experiment of the highest stakes. He was answering a call to solve a real, visible crisis of faith and safety, offering his life to become both a shield for the helpless and a warrior for God, a living, breathing paradox that would soon captivate the entire Christian world. So who exactly answered this radical call? The first men to knock on the door of this new brotherhood were not the grizzled, legendary heroes of epic poems. They were something far more real and in many ways far more interesting. The initial appeal resonated most powerfully with a very specific segment of medieval society, the second and third sons of the minor nobility. In a world governed by the rigid laws of primogeniture, where a family's entire land and title passed to the eldest son, these younger brothers faced a stark future. They were born into a warrior class, trained from childhood in the arts of war, yet they possessed no inheritance, no land of their own to rule. Their options were limited. They could linger as dependents in their older brother's household, hire out their sword as a mercenary, or try their luck in the chaotic tournament circuit. The Templars offered them a fourth path, one that transformed their military skill from a commodity for sale into a sacred vocation. It gave them a purpose that was far greater than mere survival, a chance to use their knightly training not for personal enrichment, but for a cause that promised eternal significance. They were men with everything to prove and nothing to lose, making them ideal candidates for a life of disciplined sacrifice. Alongside these landless knights came another, deeply compelling type of recruit, the veteran of the First Crusade. These were men who had witnessed the horrors and the triumphs of the campaign to take Jerusalem. They had seen the brutal reality of holy war, the bloodshed, the disease, and the moral compromises. For some, the return to a quiet life in Europe was impossible. They were haunted by memories, burdened by the violence they had committed, and disillusioned by the political squabbles that had followed the Crusade's initial success. The Templar Order presented a form of spiritual redemption. It was a way to return to the Holy Land not as a conqueror, but as a protector. It offered a structured, penitential environment where the skills that had once been used for conquest could be purified and redirected toward a defensive, protective mission. For these battle-hardened men, taking the Templar vow was a way to make peace with their past, to atone for their sins through continuous, purposeful service. Then there were the truly devout, the young men whose piety was the driving force of their lives. They were drawn by the revolutionary idea that one could achieve spiritual excellence not by retreating from the world into a monastery, but by engaging with it directly as a warrior. The traditional monastic path required a man to renounce violence entirely. The Templar path demanded that he master it and then sanctify it. This was an incredibly alluring concept for a pious individual who also felt a duty to act, to defend, and to fight for what he believed was right. It resolved a deep tension in the medieval Christian mind, offering a way to be both a man of action and a man of God simultaneously. Their motivation was less about escaping a dead-end life and more about fully embracing a new, spiritually potent form of existence. Geographically, this first wave of recruits was a distinctly northern European phenomenon. They streamed in primarily from the heartlands of France, particularly the region of Champagne, from Flanders, and from across the English Channel. These were areas with strong feudal traditions and a deep connection to the crusading ideal. They didn't arrive as a homogeneous group, but as individuals, each carrying the distinct accent of his homeland, the particular customs of his local village, and his own personal history of hopes and disappointments. Yet, upon arriving, they found a common ground in their shared desire for something more meaningful than the lives they had left behind. Their motivations were never simple or one-dimensional. It was always a complex tapestry, woven with threads of genuine faith, a very human ambition for respect and purpose, a simple wanderlust that yearned for adventure in a distant land, and a profound, almost primal yearning for brotherhood, for a place to belong. These men, with all their mixed motives and personal baggage, were the raw materials. The Order's rigorous process would now begin the work of forging them into something entirely new. So this hopeful young man has arrived, perhaps inspired by tales of holy purpose or seeking a new direction for his life. But the gates of the temple did not simply swing open for him. Gaining entry into this fledgling brotherhood was a far cry from simply volunteering. It was a grueling, multi-layered examination designed to probe the very depths of his character and resolve. The founding knights, men like Hugh Payens who had staked their own lives on this radical idea, were not looking to build a large army quickly. They were meticulously crafting a brotherhood of the most reliable and dedicated men imaginable, and that process began with an unforgiving selection designed to shatter any illusions of romantic glory. The initial screening was intensely personal and deeply probing. A candidate would be brought before a chapter of the Knights and subjected to a series of direct, uncomfortable questions. They wanted to know everything about his past. Was he a free man, or was he bound by serfdom or feudal obligations to another lord? Had he taken any other religious vows that might conflict with this new commitment? Most critically, was he in debt? The order could not afford to have its members or its reputation haunted by creditors from a former life. The knights would watch his eyes, his posture, the tone of his voice, searching for any hint of deception or pride. They were assessing more than just his answers. They were evaluating his motives. Was he here for the right reasons, driven by genuine piety and a desire for service? Or was he fleeing a troubled past, chasing fame, or simply looking for a steady meal? This verbal inquisition was the first filter, designed to immediately separate the sincere from the opportunistic. If he passed this initial interrogation, his physical and martial capabilities were put to the test. The Templars were, above all, a military order, and a weak or unskilled warrior was a liability to his brothers. He would be expected to demonstrate proficiency with the sword and lance, to control a warhorse in simulated combat, and to possess the raw stamina needed for long marches under the blistering sun while wearing heavy chainmail. But this wasn't a contest to find the most spectacular individual fighter. The assessors were looking for discipline and control, for a man who could follow complex orders and fight as part of a unit. A hot-headed duelist who sought personal glory was far less desirable than a steady, reliable soldier who understood the importance of holding the line. His body was a tool for God's work, and it needed to be strong, durable, and obedient. The most revealing part of the entire process, however, was the period of probation that followed. This was not a mere formality. It was an extended audition that could last for months or even longer. The aspirant was given the simplest, most humble tasks. He might be ordered to scrub floors, work in the kitchens, muck out the stables, or tend to the order's gardens. He was required to attend all the liturgical hours of prayer, observing the strict monastic routine that governed the day, from matins in the deep of night to compline before bed. Throughout this time, he was given no special status or respect. He was at the bottom of the hierarchy, and the established brothers watched him constantly. How did he react to being given orders by a sergeant? Did he perform his menial duties with diligence and without complaint, or did he show frustration, believing such tasks were beneath a trained knight? Did he exhibit pride, laziness, or a rebellious streak? The goal was to see the man's true nature when stripped of his former identity and subjected to humility and obedience. This daily, grinding test of character was far more telling than any single display of swordsmanship. This entire rigorous procedure served one overarching purpose: to weed out the faint of heart and those whose commitment was superficial. The life that awaited a full Templar brother was one of extreme austerity, constant danger, and absolute submission. It offered no personal wealth, no family, and no individual fame. The selection process was a mirror, forcing the aspirant to stare at his own soul and ask if he was truly prepared for such a sacrifice. For every man who persevered and was finally deemed worthy, several others would have withdrawn or been gently turned away. This was by design. The first and most critical trial on the path to becoming a Templar was not a battle against an external enemy, but an internal conquest of self. Surviving this crucible of scrutiny was the initial, essential step in the transformation from a man of the world into a brother of the temple. After enduring the long weeks of probation and scrutiny, the aspiring brother faced his final night as a free man, a period of profound isolation and reflection. He was led to a solitary cell or a quiet corner of the chapel, left alone with only his thoughts and the flickering light of a single candle. For hours, he would kneel in prayer and fasting, his body weakened to sharpen his mind and spirit. This was not a time for rest, but for a deep, sober contemplation of the choice before him. He was forced to mentally review everything he was leaving behind: his family name, any claims to inheritance, the possibility of a wife and children, and the personal freedoms he had always known. He had to confront the very real possibility of a violent death in a distant land, all while weighing it against the promise of spiritual salvation and eternal brotherhood. This solitary vigil was the final, essential preparation, stripping away the last vestiges of his old identity and making him receptive to the new one he was about to receive. As the appointed hour approached, he was escorted into the chapter hall, or a secluded chapel, a space deliberately chosen for its privacy and sanctity. The room would have been lit only by torches or candles, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to breathe with the gravity of the moment. The senior knights of the order would be present, forming a solemn circle around him, their faces stern and impassive. The atmosphere was thick with solemnity, deliberately designed to feel overwhelming and awe-inspiring. Every element of the ceremony was steeped in layered symbolism, each action intended to convey a deeper spiritual truth. The ritual was conducted in Latin, the sacred language of the Church, further separating this sacred act from the mundane world outside. For the candidate, this was the point of no return, the moment where the theoretical commitment of the past months became an irreversible, physical reality, witnessed by God and his soon-to-be brothers. The central, most powerful act of the entire ceremony was the laying of his weapons upon the altar. This was far more than just checking in his gear. Each piece he surrendered: his sword, his shield, his lance represented a part of his former life and identity. The sword was the symbol of his knightly status and his capacity for personal violence and honor. The shield represented his self-reliance and his ability to defend his own interests. By placing them on the altar, he was performing a physical declaration. He was stating, in the clearest terms possible, that he was no longer a knight who fought for personal glory or feudal obligation. He was surrendering his individual will, his capacity for personal vengeance, and his very right to self-defense, handing it all over to God and the order. From this moment forward, his strength and his weapons would no longer be his own. They belonged to the Brotherhood, to be used only as directed by its master for its holy purpose. Then came the spoken vows, the verbal contract that would bind him for the rest of his life. He would recite the threefold promise of poverty, chastity, and obedience aloud, his voice echoing in the quiet chapel. But these were not just words he was reading. He was swearing an unbreakable oath before God, a promise that, in the medieval mind, had eternal consequences. The vow of poverty meant he would never again own anything personally, not a coin, not a book, not the very clothes he would soon be given. The vow of chastity was a complete renunciation of physical love and family, redirecting all his capacity for devotion solely toward God and his brothers. And the vow of obedience was the most demanding of all, requiring him to submit his own judgment and desires entirely to the will of his superiors, to go anywhere and do anything without question. This triad of promises formed an impenetrable fence around his life, eliminating the traditional paths of wealth, lineage, and personal ambition that defined other men of his class. The culmination of the ritual was the clothing. His old tunic, the garment of his secular life, was removed. Then, one of the senior knights would bring forward the order's most iconic symbol, the white mantle. This was not merely a uniform. In the symbolism of the time, the color white represented purity, innocence, and a soul cleansed from sin. As the heavy woolen cloak was draped over his shoulders, it was a tangible sign of his new state of being. He was now clothed in purity, his past sins washed away through his commitment. He was no longer the man who had entered the chapel. He was a Templar brother, a warrior monk, a living paradox wrapped in white. The mantle was a constant physical reminder of the ideals he was now sworn to uphold, a weight he would carry every day until his death. This act of investiture marked the completion of his spiritual rebirth, the moment the aspirant truly ceased to exist and the brother was born. The intense secrecy surrounding this entire rite served a crucial psychological purpose. By conducting it away from the public eye, the order created a powerful sense of a separate reality, a world apart with its own rules and mysteries. This secrecy fostered an incredibly strong in-group bond among the brothers who had all shared the same transformative experience. They were the keepers of a sacred trust, united by a secret they shared only with each other. This sense of being set apart, of being initiates into a profound mystery, cemented their loyalty to the order above all earthly ties. The first night was not an ending, but a definitive beginning. It forged an identity so powerful and all-encompassing that it would dictate his every action, his every thought, and his very understanding of himself for the rest of his days. The man who left that chapel at dawn was in every way that mattered a new creation. The white mantle now resting on his shoulders was more than a symbol of his new purity. It was the first and most visible consequence of the oath he had just sworn. That threefold vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience was not a list of suggestions or guidelines. It was the very operating system of the Templar Brotherhood, a complete reprogramming of a man's entire existence, designed to systematically dismantle his former identity and rebuild him as a single component in a greater spiritual machine. To truly grasp the transformation these first recruits underwent, we must look past the solemn words of the ceremony and into the gritty, daily reality of what each vow actually demanded. Beginning with poverty, this was a concept far more absolute than we often understand it today. For a knight from a noble background, personal property was the foundation of his identity. His armor, his horse, his land, his ancestral sword were all extensions of himself and his family's honor. The Templar vow of poverty required a complete and total severance from this world of ownership. The rule was explicit and unforgiving. A brother could not even receive a letter from his family without permission, lest it contain a coin or a token of his past life. He owned nothing, not the simple tunic he wore under his mantle, not the sword he carried into battle, not the very bed he slept in. Everything was considered the common property of the order, held in trust and doled out as needed. This was a profound psychological shift. It eliminated the possibility of personal wealth creating jealousy or hierarchy within the brotherhood. A veteran knight who had fought in a dozen campaigns possessed exactly the same material goods as a newly sworn brother: his clothing, his armor, and his weapons. This radical economic equality was the bedrock of their unity, ensuring that every man was there for the same purpose, with no worldly distractions or personal ambitions to pull him away from the mission. His treasure was no longer stored in a chest, but in the promise of salvation and the bonds he shared with his brothers. Then there was the vow of chastity, which reached far beyond the simple physical act of celibacy. In the medieval world, a knight's legacy was his lineage, his sons who would carry his name and inherit his lands. By taking this vow, a Templar recruit was voluntarily ending his own bloodline. He was surrendering the comfort of a wife, the joy of children, and the entire emotional landscape of romantic love and family. But the demand went deeper into the realm of thought and intention. The rule commanded them to avoid not just women, but the kisses of women, which included mothers and sisters, and to cultivate a constant purity of heart and body. This was about the total redirection of human passion, the powerful drives of love, desire, and protective instinct that a man might naturally feel were to be consciously channeled away from a single individual or family and poured entirely into his devotion to God and his loyalty to the brotherhood. His family was now the order. His protective instincts were to be focused on his fellow brothers and the pilgrims they guarded. This was perhaps the most intimate and personal sacrifice, a lifelong commitment to a form of emotional austerity that ensured his loyalties could never be divided. All the power of his heart was now fuel for a single divine fire. But if poverty targeted a man's possessions and chastity his heart, the vow of obedience was an assault on his very will. This was widely considered the most difficult of the three, the cornerstone upon which the other two depended. In a society where a knight's personal honor and right to independent action were paramount, the Templar rule demanded absolute, unthinking submission. A brother was required to obey a command immediately without delay, as if it were a divine command. This wasn't about respectful cooperation. It was about the complete extinguishment of personal judgment in the face of a superior's order. He might be commanded to charge into a hopeless battle, to stand guard through the night after a long march, or to perform the most humiliating of menial tasks. To question, to hesitate, or to complain was a serious infraction. This level of obedience was what created the Templars' legendary battlefield discipline, where a squadron could hold a formation under a hail of arrows or execute a complex retreat on a single, silent signal. It turned a group of individual fighters into a single, cohesive organism. The psychological cost, however, was immense. It required a man to suppress his own survival instincts, his own sense of what was right or wrong, and to trust completely in the chain of command. This was the ultimate destruction of the individual ego, the final surrender that made the Templar not just a warrior who followed rules, but an instrument of a collective will. Together, these three vows formed an interlocking system of control and purpose. Poverty removed the distractions of the material world. Chastity eliminated the competing loyalties of family and romantic love. And obedience dissolved the individual will into the collective. This was not a life of passive monastic contemplation. It was an active, demanding, and relentless spiritual exercise performed every minute of every day. It was this comprehensive framework, this radical commitment to a life stripped of every conventional source of identity and comfort, that forged the unique character of the Templar Knight. He was no longer fighting for himself, for his lands, or for his lineage. He had become a living embodiment of an idea, a soldier whose only possession was his faith, whose only family was his brothers, and whose only will was to obey. This was the profound, almost unimaginable transformation at the heart of the oath-bound journey. Stepping across the threshold of the commandery for the first time as a sworn brother, the new Templar entered a world governed by the rhythm of bells. His former life, with its unpredictable days and personal freedoms, was now replaced by a schedule of almost mechanical precision, a relentless cycle of prayer, labor, and training designed to rebuild him from the inside out. The commandery was not merely a barracks, it was a self-contained universe with its own laws, its own language of devotion, and its own conception of time. The towering stone walls enclosed not just living quarters and stables, but also a chapel, a chapter house for meetings, a refectory for meals, workshops, and a scriptorium. This was the crucible where the abstract ideals of his oath were hammered into the concrete reality of daily existence, where the man was systematically dissolved into the brother. The architectural layout of the commandery itself reinforced this new way of life. Life was lived in a series of distinct, purpose-built spaces, and a brother's movement between them was dictated by the canonical hours, the set times for prayer that structured the monastic day. His morning would begin not with a casual sunrise, but with the urgent call to matins, often in the deep, quiet hours of the night. He would rise from his simple cot in the dormitory, a room he shared with his brothers, and make his way through the cold, dark corridors to the chapel. There, in the flickering candlelight, the community would gather to chant the psalms, their voices a unified murmur in the vast silence. This was followed by lauds at dawn, a service greeting the new day not with personal ambition but with collective praise. Throughout the day, the bells would summon him back to the choir for prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before retiring. This relentless cycle of prayer was the spiritual backbone of his existence, a constant reminder that his primary identity was that of a religious, a man of God, and only secondarily that of a warrior. When the bells released him from the chapel, his time was immediately claimed by the demands of the material world. A significant portion of his day was dedicated to manual labor, a practice deeply rooted in the Benedictine monastic tradition that informed the Templar rule. This was not busy work, it was a practical necessity and a spiritual exercise intertwined. He might be assigned to the stables where he would learn to groom, feed, and care for the order's most vital assets, its war horses. A knight who understood the anatomy and temperament of his mount was a more effective fighter, and this humble care built a bond of trust between man and animal that was crucial on the battlefield. In the workshops, he would be taught to mend his own chainmail, a tedious and skilled task of linking thousands of iron rings. He might assist in repairing a saddle, fletching arrows, or honing swords to a razor's edge. For a nobleman accustomed to having servants maintain his equipment, this hands-on labor was a continuous physical lesson in the vow of poverty. He owned nothing, not even the tools he used, and his personal comfort was irrelevant next to the condition of the order's collective property. This work cultivated humility, self-reliance, and a profound appreciation for the tools of his trade. The training ground was where his dual identity as monk and warrior was most visibly fused. Here, the spiritual discipline of the chapel met the physical demands of combat. Training was not a sporadic exercise but a daily, methodical ritual. He would practice for hours with the broadsword, not in flashy, individual duels, but in repetitive, precise drills designed for formation fighting. He and his brothers would practice mounting and dismounting their horses in full armor, executing complex cavalry maneuvers as a single unit, and responding to a series of standardized horn signals and hand commands. The goal was to eliminate individual flair and replace it with collective, unthinking synchronization. The chaos of battle was to be met with a wall of disciplined, predictable movement. This training was grueling, conducted under the heat of the sun while wearing heavy gambesons and chainmail, building the endurance that would be essential on long marches through the arid landscapes of the Holy Land. His body was being conditioned to obey as readily as his spirit. Perhaps the most telling daily ritual was the communal meal in the refectory. The brothers would file into the hall in silence and take their places at long wooden tables. The rule forbade speaking during meals, a stark contrast to the boisterous feasts of a secular knight's hall. Instead, as they ate their simple, nourishing fare, often bread, pottage, vegetables, and occasionally fish, with meat reserved for a few days a week to maintain strength, one of the literate brothers, often a chaplain or a sergeant, would read aloud from a religious text. This might be a passage from the Bible, a saint's life, or most importantly, a section from the order's own rule, reinforcing their unique customs and regulations. This practice transformed a biological necessity into an extension of their devotional life. There was no moment for idle gossip or worldly discussion. Every hour, even mealtime, was an opportunity for spiritual edification and a reminder of their shared purpose. The silence was not empty but full of purpose, a collective focusing of intention that permeated the entire commandery. This unyielding routine, this seamless weaving of the sacred and the profane, was the true engine of the Templar transformation. The commandery was a machine for reshaping human nature, It systematically broke down the habits of a lifetime, the pride of ownership, the distraction of personal conversation, the pursuit of individual glory. In their place, it built new neural pathways centered on communal responsibility, silent obedience, and a constant, underlying awareness of God. The new brother's old world, with its personal feuds, its romantic entanglements, and its concerns for status, began to feel distant and unreal. The commandery became his entire reality, a fortress not just against external enemies, but against the internal enemy of his own former self. Within these walls, through the daily grind of prayer, labor, and disciplined training, the individual knight was gradually effaced, and the living instrument of the order was forged. While his body was being hardened on the training field, the recruit's mind and soul were undergoing an equally demanding transformation within the chapel and the chapter house. The order recognized that a knight whose spirit was weak would be a liability, no matter how skilled he was with a blade. Their spiritual curriculum was therefore not a secondary concern, but the very foundation upon which all else was built. It was a carefully designed program aimed at forging an unshakable faith and a resilient resolve, equipping him for the unique psychological and moral challenges of being a warrior monk. This was where he learned to wield his most powerful weapon, one that no enemy could ever disarm: his unwavering belief in the righteousness of his cause and the protection of his God. This spiritual training was deeply rooted in the Benedictine monastic tradition, but it was adapted with a clear, practical purpose. The rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized obedience, stability, and a life of communal prayer, provided the structural backbone. However, for the Templar, the stability was not found within the walls of a single cloister, but in the mobile community of his brotherhood, whether they were stationed in Jerusalem or on patrol in the desolate hills of Galilee. The canonical hours of prayer matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline structured his entire day, but their function was dual. On one level, they were acts of collective worship, affirming his identity as a religious. On another, they were drills for the soul, the discipline of rising in the dead of night for matins, of breaking from physical labor for sext, or of ending the day with compline, instilled a mental fortitude and a rhythm of devotion that could be maintained even on campaign, far from the comfort of a permanent chapel. This was faith as a practiced, relentless discipline, a muscle that was exercised until it became second nature. The content of his theological instruction was equally pragmatic. He was taught the core tenets of the Christian faith, of course, but the focus was sharply aimed at the dilemmas he would inevitably face. A great deal of time was spent addressing the complex morality of his vocation. How could a man who had taken a vow to follow the Prince of Peace, who taught turning the other cheek, justify his role as a professional soldier? The answer, as his instructors explained, lay in the concept of right intention. His violence was not for personal gain, revenge, or territorial conquest. It was an act of charity, a use of force solely to protect the innocent and defenseless, the pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. He was taught to see himself as a channel of God's justice and mercy, a shield for the weak. This theological framing was essential for his psychological survival. It allowed him to reconcile the act of killing with the state of grace he was striving to maintain. He also received specific warnings about the spiritual pitfalls that awaited a fighting man. The greatest of these was the sin of pride. After a successful skirmish or a victorious battle, it would be all too easy for a knight to swell with arrogance, to believe the victory was due to his own skill and courage alone. The spiritual masters of the order cautioned relentlessly against this. They taught that any success was a gift from God, granted through his favor, and that personal glory was a poison to the soul, fracturing the unity of the brotherhood and leading to disobedience. Conversely, they also prepared him for the temptation of despair. In defeat, after witnessing the death of beloved brothers or the failure of a military objective, a man could easily fall into the belief that God had abandoned them. The curriculum provided the antidote. Such trials were to be seen as tests of faith, purifications sent by God to strengthen their resolve and humble their spirits. Both victory and defeat were to be met with the same prayerful acceptance, keeping the soul in a state of equilibrium. This intense spiritual conditioning aimed for a seemingly impossible outcome: to create a man who could engage in the brutal, visceral reality of close-quarters combat and yet return from the fray with his conscience intact and his peace with God undisturbed. He was being trained to compartmentalize not through suppression but through sanctification. The battlefield was not a place where God was absent, it was another arena for his service. When he fought, he did so with a clear mind and a focused heart, seeing his duty as a form of prayer in action. The violence he committed was, in his worldview, stripped of personal animosity. He was not fighting out of hatred for the man in front of him, but out of love for the pilgrims behind him and obedience to the divine will he served. This mental and spiritual framework allowed him to perform his terrible duty without being consumed by it, to be a soldier of Christ in the most literal and demanding sense, his faith acting as both his shield and his compass in a world of moral ambiguity and relentless violence. While the spiritual life within the commandery provided the foundation, the training yard was where that faith was forged into a physical instrument of immense power. The transformation of a skilled secular knight into a Templar brother required far more than just maintaining his fighting prowess. It demanded a complete re-engineering of his entire martial mindset. In the outside world, a knight's reputation was often built on individual feats of arms, the spectacular victory in a tournament, the single combat that decided a skirmish. But within the temple, such personal glory was not just discouraged, it was systematically trained out of him. The new brother learned a difficult but vital lesson. His own life, his own skill, even his own victory, were insignificant compared to the integrity of the formation and the success of the squadron as a whole. His personal identity as a fighter was dissolved into the collective fighting unit, creating a military entity that was far more than the sum of its parts. This philosophy came to life through relentless, methodical drilling. The new recruit, already proficient with a sword, would now spend countless hours on the practice field, repeating the same basic strikes and defensive parries not for flair but for absolute consistency. He practiced with the broadsword, a heavy, brutal weapon, learning to deliver controlled, powerful blows that could break through an opponent's guard without leaving his own position exposed. But he was never just practicing alone. He was always part of a line, a wall of men moving in unison. The same applied to his training with the shield. He learned to interlock his large, kite-shaped shield with those of the brothers on his left and right, creating a nearly impenetrable wall of wood and iron. This was not a static defense, it was a mobile fortress. They would practice advancing slowly in this formation, a steady, crushing advance where every step was synchronized, every shield held at the exact same angle. The goal was to make this unity so instinctive that even in the screaming chaos of a real battle, the line would hold. The individual's survival depended entirely on the discipline of his brothers, and his primary duty was to maintain his part of the wall for them. The true heart of Templar tactical superiority, however, lay in their mastery of the cavalry charge. This was where the individual knight, his powerful warhorse, and his squadron became a single, devastating weapon. The training for this was extraordinarily complex and dangerous. A recruit had to learn to control his destrier, a massive and highly strung animal, using mostly his knees and balance, as his hands were occupied with his shield and lance. He practiced the entire sequence of the charge over and over, forming up in a tight line, receiving the signal to advance, moving first at a trot and then, at the precise moment, breaking into a full gallop. The challenge was to maintain that tight formation at speed. A scattered charge was a wasted charge. He had to keep his place in the line, his lance couched firmly under his arm, its point aimed in unison with his brothers. They would practice against quintains rotating posts with shields, learning to strike with enough collective force to shatter an enemy line on impact. The sound of dozens of hooves pounding the earth in perfect rhythm was the sound of their prayer in action, a physical hymn of overwhelming force delivered with chilling coordination. Beyond the core weapons, their training incorporated a harsh regime of endurance and logistical conditioning. A Templar knight was not just a fighter, he was a soldier who had to traverse the harsh, arid landscapes of the Holy Land. They undertook long marches in full gear, which could weigh over 60 pounds. They would march for miles under the relentless sun, wearing their heavy gambesons and chainmail hauberks, their helmets hanging from their saddles until the moment of combat. This built the physical and mental stamina needed for campaigning in a land where water was scarce and shade was a luxury. They also drilled in silent signals. In the din of battle, shouted orders could be lost. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter used a system of horn blasts, banner movements, and hand gestures to communicate complex maneuvers, a wheel to the flank, a feigned retreat, a rally to a new position. This required every man to be constantly aware of his commander and his brothers, his eyes as important as his sword arm. The ability to execute a controlled, pre-planned retreat was considered as vital as charging, a skill that saved countless lives and preserved the order's fighting strength for another day. Ultimately, this entire grueling regimen served a single, overarching spiritual purpose. The Templars did not see a contradiction between their prayers in the chapel and their practice in the yard. For them, the discipline required to hold a formation under a hail of arrows was the same discipline required to maintain focus during the long night office of matins. The obedience needed to couch a lance on command was the same obedience that led them to their knees in prayer. The training yard was not separate from their devotional life. It was an extension of it. Every controlled swing of the sword was an exercise in controlling passion and anger. Every act of holding the line for a brother was an act of charity. They were forging their bodies into living weapons, but the intent was never for personal domination. The battlefield, in their eyes, was indeed their chapel, a place of terrible, violent sacrifice where their actions, if performed with the right intention and perfect discipline, were not sins but offerings. Their combat, in its precision and its selfless unity, became their most fervent and powerful form of prayer. The word brother was the first and most important word a new recruit learned to use within the walls of the commandery, and it carried a weight far beyond its simple syllable. In the world he had left behind, this term might have been reserved for a biological sibling, a relationship bound by blood and inheritance, often fraught with rivalry and complex family politics. Here it meant something entirely different. To call another man brother was to acknowledge a bond forged not by accident of birth, but by a conscious, sacred choice. It was a declaration of mutual responsibility, a promise that his well-being was now inextricably linked to your own, and that you would share not just a roof and a rule, but a single collective fate. This was the bedrock of the Templar social structure, a revolutionary concept that replaced the hierarchical and often treacherous web of feudal obligations with a flat, fraternal loyalty. A knight who had once been a vassal, obligated to serve a distant lord for a piece of land, was now a peer in a spiritual army, his primary duty owed to the man standing beside him. This redefinition of relationship was the first step in building a cohesion that would become the envy and the terror of their enemies. This profound bond was not born from abstract ideals alone. It was physically forged in the relentless, shared intimacy of their daily existence. The new brother lived his entire life within a few feet of his comrades. He slept in a common dormitory, often in a large hall where simple cots or straw pallets were lined up in rows with no privacy beyond the darkness. He awoke with them to the same bell for matins, his voice joining theirs in the pre-dawn chant. He broke his fast with them in a silent refectory, hearing the same scripture read aloud. He trained with them for hours in the dusty yard, his shield interlocked with theirs, his movements synchronized until they breathed as one organism. He cared for the same horses, mended his gear alongside them in the workshop, and stood watch with them on the same cold, dark battlements. There were no secrets in this life, no private indulgences or hidden corners. Every strength and every weakness was on constant, quiet display. This unbroken proximity, stripped of all pretense and personal space, created a level of familiarity and trust that most men would only ever experience with a spouse or a twin. They knew each other's moods, each other's fears, and the subtle tells that signaled exhaustion or resolve. In this crucible of communal living, biological bonds, which could be strained by distance or disagreement, were replaced by the visceral, daily reality of a shared struggle, creating a unity that was often stronger than blood. This powerful sense of belonging was the Order's greatest psychological offering. Many of these men had arrived feeling like outsiders in their own lives, younger sons with no patrimony, veterans alienated by the world they had returned to, or idealists disillusioned by the gap between faith and practice. The Templar Brotherhood gave them an identity that was both elite and inclusive. It offered a clear, unequivocal answer to the timeless human questions of who am I and where do I belong. He was a brother of the temple. His family was the Order. His home was any commandery that flew the Beauseant, the Order's black and white banner. His purpose was protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land. This totalizing identity was incredibly potent, filling a void that land or title could never satisfy. He was no longer just a man from a specific village in France or a minor noble from England. He was part of a transnational entity that answered directly to the Pope. This erased the petty regional loyalties and prejudices that often fractured other Crusader armies, creating a brotherhood where a knight from Flanders and a knight from Provence could see each other as true equals, united by a shared oath and a shared destiny. Of course, friction was inevitable. Men living in such close quarters under immense pressure and strict discipline were bound to have disagreements, moments of pride, or flashes of anger. The Order's rule, however, had a meticulous system for managing these internal conflicts, designed to prevent them from festering and fracturing the unity of the group. Disputes were not settled by duels or public arguments, as they might be in a secular army. Instead, they were brought before the chapter, the assembly of the brothers. Here, in a formal setting, grievances were aired, and the master or his senior knights would act as mediators, seeking a resolution based on the principles of humility and forgiveness outlined in their rule. The emphasis was always on reconciliation and the restoration of harmony, not on assigning blame or winning an argument. A brother who held a grudge or refused to reconcile was considered a danger to the entire community, as his bitterness could poison the well of mutual trust that they all depended on for survival. This internal justice system reinforced the idea that loyalty to one's brothers and the health of the Order superseded any personal grievance. It was a practical application of their spiritual ideals, ensuring that the brotherhood remained a source of strength, not a cause of internal collapse. This carefully cultivated camaraderie became their most vital asset when facing the extreme dangers of their mission. On a dusty road outside Jerusalem, ambushed by a superior force, a Templar knight did not fight for a king, for payment, or for personal glory. He fought for the man to his left and the man to his right, his brothers. He knew their names, their stories, their families back home that they had all renounced. He had heard them pray, had shared his bread with them, and had trained beside them for countless hours. The thought of failing them, of breaking the line and leaving them exposed, was a more powerful motivator than any fear of death. This unwavering solidarity, born in the dormitory and hardened on the training ground, allowed them to undertake missions that would have been unthinkable for other military units. They could hold a defensive position against overwhelming odds, execute a disciplined fighting retreat that required perfect trust, and care for their wounded with a devotion that went beyond mere duty. In the end, the order was more than an institution to them. It was his family providing the emotional bonds he had surrendered. It was his country giving him an identity and a land to defend. And it was his cause offering a purpose that gave meaning to every sacrifice. This triad of belonging created a psychological fortress around each man, making the Templar Brotherhood not just a fighting force, but an unbreakable community of the spirit. After months of relentless training, of prayers whispered in the chill of dawn and sword drills repeated until his muscles screamed, the day finally arrived. The theoretical world of the commandery, with its controlled routines and predictable challenges, was about to be replaced by the unforgiving landscape of the Holy Land. His first official mission would likely be deceptively simple in its description: a patrol along the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, or perhaps garrison duty at a lonely, windswept outpost guarding a mountain pass. On paper, these tasks seemed almost mundane, a far cry from the great battles of legend. But he and his brothers knew the truth. That road to Jerusalem was a ribbon of dust and rock flanked by jagged hills perfect for an ambush, and that remote outpost was a solitary beacon in a sea of potential hostility. The mundane nature of the duty masked its profound peril, making it the perfect crucible for his first real test. This was the moment where every ounce of his training, every whispered prayer, and every sacred vow would be measured against the brutal, unscripted reality of his calling. The preparation for this mission was a ritual in itself, steeped in solemnity. He would check and recheck his equipment with a focus he had never known before. Each link of his chainmail was inspected for weakness, the edge of his sword honed to a perfect sharpness, his saddle and tack examined for any flaw. This was not the anxious fussing of a novice, but the deliberate, practiced care of a man whose life and the lives of his brothers depended on the reliability of his gear. Then the squadron would gather in the chapel for a final mass. The chaplain would offer blessings, praying for their safety and for the strength to fulfill their duty. As he knelt there, the weight of his white mantle felt heavier than ever before. It was no longer just a symbol of purity. It was a target, a declaration to any watching enemy, and a constant physical reminder of the immense burden he now carried. He was not just a soldier going on patrol. He was a representative of the entire order of the temple, and his actions would reflect upon every brother who had ever worn the cross. The silence in the chapel was thick with unspoken thoughts, a collective offering of apprehension and resolve before they stepped into the unknown. Then came the moment of departure, the slow clatter of hooves on stone as they rode out from the safety of the commandery gates. The world outside was immediately different. The air was filled with unfamiliar scents, dust, wild herbs, the distant smoke of a campfire. The landscape, which might have seemed picturesque from a distance, now felt vast, exposed, and full of hidden threats. Every shadow in a ravine, every flutter of a bird from a thicket could signal danger. His senses, dulled by the predictable rhythms of the monastery fortress, were now screamingly alert. He learned to read the land, to understand what constituted normal movement and what was an anomaly. The veteran brothers in the squadron would point out signs almost imperceptible to his untrained eye, a disturbance in the dust that could be a recent footprint, a particular stillness in the animal life that suggested a hidden presence. This constant, low-grade tension was his new normal, a state of hyper-awareness that was as mentally exhausting as any physical labor. He was learning that a Templar's vigilance was his first and most constant duty. When the attack came, it was never as it had been in training. There was no orderly line of quintains to charge, no clear signal to begin. It was a sudden, violent explosion of noise and motion. One moment the road was quiet, the next a hail of arrows would whistle from the rocks above, and a band of raiders would erupt from concealment with guttural war cries. The chaos was absolute, a sensory overload of screaming men, panicked horses, and the deafening clash of steel. This was the moment of truth. All those hours of drilling on the practice field now had to function on pure, ingrained instinct. There was no time to think, only to react. He would find himself moving automatically, his shield rising to block an axe swing, his sword arm parrying a blow, his body shifting to close a gap in the formation. The theoretical enemy was now a real, breathing man, a face contorted with rage, eyes locked on his, seeking his death. The stark reality of combat, the visceral shock of it, was something no training could ever fully simulate. In this maelstrom, he faced the ultimate test of his vows. The vow of obedience meant holding his position in the line, even when every fiber of his being screamed to break ranks and flee, or to chase down a fleeing opponent. It meant trusting his commander's horn signals implicitly, even if the order seemed to lead into greater danger. The vow of poverty was reflected in his gear. There was no finer, personally commissioned sword to give him an edge, only the standard issue, dependable equipment of the order, the same as every other brother. But it was the vow of chastity, the redirecting of all human passion, that faced its strangest trial. In the heat of battle, he was required to fight without hatred, to kill without passion. This was not a duel of personal vengeance. It was a clinical, brutal act of protection. He was defending the pilgrims who might be just over the next ridge, and his brothers who stood shoulder to shoulder with him. He learned to see the enemy not as a demon to be despised, but as an obstacle to the order's holy duty, a threat to be neutralized with dispassionate efficiency. This mental and emotional control, this separation of the act from the emotion, was perhaps the most difficult skill of all to master. Success in this baptism by fire was not measured in a tally of enemies slain or in personal accolades. When the skirmish was over and the dust settled, the true metrics of victory were far more profound. Had the Pilgrim road been secured, had the squadron held its formation and protected one another with minimal losses? Were the order's standards and the wounded retrieved from the field? If a single pilgrim had been saved because of their stand, the mission was a success. There were no cheers of victory, only a grim, swift assessment. The brothers would tend to their wounded, see to their dead with a quiet, solemn dignity, and quickly regroup to continue their patrol or reinforce the outpost. The new brother, his hands perhaps trembling from the adrenaline, his white mantle now stained with dust and sweat, would look around at his comrades. In their calm, resolute faces, he saw a reflection of his own experience. They had not been transformed into giddy conquerors, they had been confirmed as guardians. He had not just survived a fight, he had performed his duty under the most extreme duress, and he had done it as part of the whole. The theoretical identity of a Templar, once a concept learned in the chapter house, was now seared into his soul by the heat of combat and the cold clarity of survival. He had faced the chaos and upheld the order within it. Returning to the commandery, he was no longer a recruit who had trained for battle. He was a brother who had lived it, his place in the fraternity now earned not through oath alone, but through the shared, unspoken understanding of what they had endured together. For a new Templar brother, fresh from the disciplined sanctuary of the commandery, the political reality of the Holy Land was a bewildering and treacherous maze. He quickly discovered that the clear-cut lines of faith he had imagined a simple division between Christian and Muslim were a dangerous illusion. The world of Outremer, the collective name for the Crusader states, was a kaleidoscope of shifting loyalties and intricate power struggles. Here, a Christian baron from Tripoli might secretly ally with a Muslim emir from Damascus against a rival Christian prince from Antioch, all while a Venetian merchant consortium manipulated both sides for a better trade deal. The new knight's duty was not merely to patrol a road, it was to understand the complex web of motivations that made that road safe or perilous in the first place. His white mantle made him a highly visible player on this chessboard, and every move he made, from a routine patrol route to a chance encounter with a local sheikh, carried political weight he was now responsible for understanding. His first and most immediate political education came from navigating the fraught relationships within the Crusader nobility itself. These European lords who ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch were a fractious and often jealous bunch. They were perpetually short of men and money, and they viewed the rapidly growing Templar order with a mixture of dependence and deep suspicion. On one hand, the Templars were an elite, disciplined military force they desperately needed to defend their fragile kingdoms. On the other, the order was alarmingly independent. A new brother would witness how his order's unique status, answering directly to the Pope in Rome, placed them above the authority of local kings. This meant they could refuse to participate in a military campaign they deemed unwise or strategically unsound, a move that could infuriate a monarch like the King of Jerusalem, who saw it as both a personal insult and a threat to his sovereignty. The young knight learned that his vow of obedience now extended to understanding these delicate power dynamics. Following his commander's order to withhold support from a royal army was an act of political defiance, not just military prudence, and he would have to bear the scorn of local knights who saw the Templars as arrogant and aloof. Simultaneously, he had to learn the intricate art of interaction with the various Muslim powers, a process that defied the simplistic propaganda of holy war. The Islamic world was not a monolithic enemy but a divided landscape of competing dynasties and emirates. The Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and a host of independent Turkish atabegs and emirs in Syria were all vying for power, often seeing each other as greater threats than the Crusader states. The Templars, pragmatic to their core, became masters at exploiting these divisions. A new brother might find himself part of a diplomatic escort, riding to negotiate a temporary truce or hudna with the emir of a neighboring region. In these tense meetings, he would see his senior commanders treat Muslim rulers with a formal respect, hammering out agreements that ensured the safety of pilgrim routes for a season or secured the order's borders, even while both sides knew the war would eventually resume. He learned that the enemy could be a reasonable negotiating partner one day and a formidable battlefield commander the next. This required a mental flexibility that contrasted sharply with the absolute certainties of his faith, teaching him that survival in the Holy Land depended as much on shrewd diplomacy as on martial prowess. Perhaps the most complex political tightrope the order walked was its relationship with the Church and other Christian powers. While the Templars were officially answerable only to the Pope, the papal court was often thousands of miles away, and its directives could be slow, ambiguous, or completely out of touch with the desperate realities on the ground. Local bishops and patriarchs in the Holy Land, who wielded significant secular power, often resented the Templars' independence and their direct line to Rome, creating yet another layer of ecclesiastical politics to navigate. Furthermore, the Order's relationship with their great rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, was a constant source of friction. While they would fight side by side in a crisis, they were fierce competitors for donations, land, and influence back in Europe. A new recruit would quickly sense the underlying tension when Hospitaller and Templar contingents were in the same room, a rivalry fueled by different philosophies and a competition for the same pool of resources and recruits. He learned that Christian unity was an ideal, not a reality, and that the Order had to constantly assert its interests against other powerful Christian institutions. This relentless political maneuvering was not a distraction from the Templar mission. It was fundamental to it, the Order's vast network of castles, its ability to move men and supplies safely, and its financial operations all depended on a complex system of agreements, truces, and understood boundaries. A new knight's education was no longer confined to the sword and the psalter. He had to learn to read a political landscape, to understand that a shift in power in Damascus could mean increased raids in Galilee, or that a feud between two Christian barons could open a strategic pass to Muslim forces. A misstep, an overly aggressive patrol that violated a tacit agreement, or an insult to a touchy local emir, could unravel years of careful diplomacy and plunge a region back into open warfare. His journey was no longer just about personal piety and martial skill. It was about becoming a guardian of the Order's precarious political standing. He was learning to wield influence as deftly as he wielded his sword, understanding that in the fractured world of Outremer, a well-negotiated truce could save more lives and secure more of the Holy Land than the most glorious and bloody cavalry charge. Yet beneath the gleaming white mantle and the stoic discipline, there beat a profoundly human heart. The transformation into a Templar brother was not a magical erasure of a man's past, his personality, or his deepest needs. In the quiet moments between prayers, in the stillness of the night watch, or in the exhausted aftermath of a skirmish, every recruit confronted a private battlefield within his own soul. The Order's rigorous structure was designed to master these internal struggles, but it could never entirely eliminate them. These unseen conflicts, the silent wars fought behind a mask of pious resolve, are perhaps the most relatable and poignant part of their entire story, revealing that the greatest enemy a Templar faced was often not the warrior across the field, but the whispering doubts and enduring human longings within himself. One of the most persistent and painful struggles was the confrontation with profound spiritual doubt. A young man might have joined the Order filled with fiery certainty, convinced he was embarking on a direct path to God's service. But the reality of life in the Holy Land was messy, brutal, and morally ambiguous. He might find himself praying for divine guidance in the chapel 1 hour, and the next be standing over the body of a young Muslim soldier, no older than himself, whose life he had just taken. In such moments, the clear theological framework provided by the Order that this was an act of charitable protection could feel thin and abstract. He would be tormented by questions that had no easy answer. If this was God's work, why did it feel so much like butchery? Where was God in the screams of the dying, in the agony of a mortally wounded brother, or in the failure of a mission that led to the slaughter of innocent pilgrims? The constant proximity to violent death could erode the foundations of his faith, leading to a chilling, isolating fear that he had dedicated his life to a hollow cause, that the divine presence he sought was nothing more than a comforting story told to children. This was a crisis not of skill but of meaning, and it was a shadow that could haunt even the most devout brother. Alongside this crisis of faith came the relentless, grinding weight of loneliness, a direct consequence of the vow of chastity. This was far more than just the absence of physical intimacy. It was the total renunciation of an entire dimension of human experience. During a festive season like Christmas, while the commandery observed the day with solemn prayer, his mind might wander across the sea to the family hearth in France. He would picture his mother's face, his brothers celebrating, the possibility of a wife and children that was now forever lost to him. He would never know the comfort of a partner, the pride of watching a son take his first steps, or the simple, affirming love of a family that was his own. This sacrifice was a perpetual emptiness, a hollow space where a fundamental human connection should have been. For some, this manifested as a dull, persistent ache of melancholy. For others, especially those who had joined young and perhaps had never known romantic love, it was a restless, undefined yearning for a connection the rule forbade them to even acknowledge. The Brotherhood offered a POWERFUL Chinese letter, but it could not fully replicate the unique bonds of a wife or the legacy of a bloodline. This chosen solitude was a heavy cross to bear, a silent sorrow carried for a lifetime. The vow of obedience, while the source of their legendary discipline, was another fertile ground for internal conflict, particularly for men of strong will or noble birth who were accustomed to command. The rule demanded that a brother surrender his own judgment completely, following an order immediately without delay, as if it were a divine command. But what happened when a knight, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, believed his commander's decision was tactically foolish, even suicidal? He was required to swallow his expertise, to silence the voice of experience screaming in his mind, and to march into a situation he knew was a disaster. This suppression of personal judgment could create a simmering internal friction, a resentment that festered beneath a surface of compliance. A proud man, used to the respect his title and skill had afforded him in the secular world, might chafe at being ordered to perform the most menial tasks by a superior he did not personally respect. The strict hierarchy, while necessary, could feel like an insult to his intelligence and his hard-won competence. Learning to submit, not just outwardly but inwardly, to extinguish his own will entirely, was perhaps the most difficult spiritual martial art he had to master, and failure to do so led to a private war between his ego and his oath. These internal pressures, the doubt, the loneliness, the chafing against authority, inevitably created moments of what the order would have termed temptation. A brother on patrol in a bustling city like Acre might catch the eye of a woman, and for a fleeting second, the entire structure of his chosen life would tremble. The thought of a different path, a life of freedom, family, and personal choice, could flash with irresistible brilliance in his mind. Or, in a moment of despair after a bitter defeat, he might be tempted to simply walk away, to desert his post and find a ship back to Europe, to reclaim the identity he had surrendered. We have no records of how many men entertained these thoughts, but the very existence of severe punishments for desertion and infractions against chastity in the rule proves that the temptations were real and ever present. The psychological fortitude required to constantly resist these baser impulses, to reaffirm his commitment daily in the face of such powerful human desires, was a testament to a strength that went far beyond the physical. His greatest battles were not announced by war horns, but fought in the silent, solitary confines of his own conscience. Ultimately, the Templar's spiritual journey was not the serene, upward path to enlightenment we might imagine. It was a tumultuous, often painful, cycle of falling and rising. He would experience a moment of transcendent certainty during a beautiful chant in the chapel, only to have it shattered by the horrors of the next day's patrol. He would feel the powerful comfort of brotherhood during a shared meal, and then the sharp sting of isolation during a long, cold night on watch. This was not a failure of the system, but rather its intended function. The rule and the routine were not meant to create perfect, emotionless automatons. They were designed to provide a sturdy framework within which a man could constantly struggle with his own humanity, a process the Order's spiritual masters would have called purification. The doubt, the loneliness, the pride, these were not enemies to be vanquished once and for all, but dragons to be wrestled with every single day. The true measure of a Templar's strength was not the absence of internal conflict, but his relentless, weary, yet unwavering decision to pick up his shield and stand his ground on that most personal of front lines, facing down the vulnerabilities of his own heart with the same courage he showed against any external foe. This vow of personal poverty, which stripped a brother of any claim to ownership, created one of the most fascinating paradoxes of the entire Templar experiment. While the individual knight owned nothing, not even the clothes on his back, the order he served was rapidly evolving into one of the most sophisticated and powerful economic entities of the medieval world. This was not a contradiction born of hypocrisy, but a necessity born of their ambitious mission. A single knight, fully equipped with a war horse, armor, and weapons, represented a staggering capital investment, and maintaining hundreds of such knights in a perpetual state of readiness across the vast distance between Europe and the Holy Land required a financial engine of immense power. The new brother, who had sworn to renounce all worldly wealth, soon found that a significant part of his service could involve managing that very wealth on behalf of the collective. His spiritual journey now included a crash course in the practical economics of divine warfare, where the purity of his personal poverty was secured by the immense material resources of the order he embodied. This economic machinery was initially fueled by the powerful engine of pious donation. Across Europe, from kings and queens to minor lords and even prosperous peasants, devout Christians saw supporting the Templars as a direct pathway to spiritual merit. A brother with a talent for letters and administration might find himself assigned to a newly established commandery in rural France, tasked with overseeing a gift of farmland. This was not a simple matter of collecting rent. He had to become an expert agriculturalist, understanding crop rotations, soil quality, and animal husbandry to maximize the yield from these lands. He would manage the local peasants who worked the soil, ensuring that the harvest of wheat, barley, or wine was sufficient not only to feed the brothers stationed there but also to produce a surplus. This surplus was the key. It could be sold at local markets generating cash, or more crucially, it could be shipped east to feed the armies on the frontier. A vineyard in Champagne, donated by a grateful count, wasn't just a piece of property. It was a supply line of wine and morale for knights enduring the harsh Levantine sun. The brother overseeing it was not a lord in a castle, but a steward of God's resources, his hands spiritually clean even as they were practically engaged in the most worldly of businesses. The logistical challenge of moving these resources was itself a monumental undertaking that required specialized knowledge. The order developed an intricate network that functioned like a primitive but highly effective multinational corporation. A recruit with a head for numbers and organization might be pulled into the labyrinthine task of coordinating this flow. He would help manage the order's own fleet of ships, which regularly plied the Mediterranean between Marseille, Sicily, and Acre, carrying everything from hardened Frankish knights and new war horses to barrels of salted meat, iron for weaponry, and carefully packed donations of coin and precious objects. At the ports, other brothers, often sergeants with experience in trade, would oversee the unloading, storage, and redistribution of these goods. They had to understand tariffs, negotiate with local merchants for supplementary supplies, and maintain secure warehouses. This system was so reliable and secure that it soon attracted the business of others. Kings and nobles began using the Templars' network to transfer their own funds and treasures to the Holy Land, knowing the Order's fortresses and ships were the safest conduit. The Templar house in a city like Paris or London effectively became a proto-bank, offering letters of credit where a pilgrim could deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in Jerusalem. The brother managing this system was performing a sacred duty, ensuring the lifeblood of resources reached the fighting arms in the East, yet his daily work involved the very financial instruments his vow of poverty personally forbade him from touching. This immersion in the world of commerce and estate management created a profound and constant tension that every brother had to navigate internally. On one hand, his spiritual life was one of austere simplicity, plain food, a hard bed, and the plain white mantle of his order. On the other hand, his daily labor might involve calculating the profit from a wool trade deal with Flanders, or authorizing the purchase of a new quarry to supply stone for a castle. How did he reconcile the pursuit of economic efficiency with the rejection of material desire? The resolution lay in a radical reframing of purpose. The Order taught that this work was not undertaken for profit in a worldly sense, but for sustenance in a spiritual war. Every bushel of grain sold, every interest-free loan administered to a king, every well-managed estate was not about amassing wealth, but about fueling the mission. The resources were not an end in themselves. They were the means to keep brothers in the field, to build and garrison castles that protected pilgrims, and to ultimately secure the holy places. The individual brother's poverty was the proof of his detachment. The Order's wealth was the tool of his devotion. He learned to see himself as a guardian of a sacred trust, his financial acumen and managerial skill being just another form of obedience, another weapon in the Order's arsenal to be wielded with discipline and purity of intention. This perspective transformed what could have been a corrupting influence into a powerful, unifying force. The brother managing a rich agricultural estate in England lived in the same humble conditions as the brother guarding a bleak outpost in the Judean desert. They wore the same habit, followed the same rule, and shared in the same spiritual rewards. The vast economic disparity between the commandery in Europe and the frontline fortress in the Levant was invisible on a personal level. This created a powerful system of mutual dependence. The brother in the East fought with the confidence that his supplies and reinforcements were being managed by capable hands thousands of miles away. The brother in the West labored with the certainty that his work in the fields and counting houses had a direct life-or-death impact on his spiritual brothers facing the enemy. It turned the entire Order into a single, integrated organism, where the peaceful, prosperous hinterlands in Europe existed to sustain the militant, austere extremities in the East. The economics of devotion, therefore, were not a stain on the Templar ideal but its essential, if complex, circulatory system, pumping the vital resources of faith and material needed to keep the dream of a warrior monk alive for nearly 2 centuries. For a new Templar brother, the abstract ideals of his oath poverty, obedience, a life dedicated to God, found their most concrete and enduring expression not on the battlefield, but in the dust and sweat of the construction site. The Order's survival depended on a network of secure strongholds, and every able-bodied brother, regardless of his noble birth, was expected to contribute to their creation. This was not a duty reserved for specialized engineers alone. It was a communal act of devotion, a physical prayer offered up in stone and mortar. A recruit might find himself arriving at a windswept coastal promontory or a stark hilltop where the foundations of a new castle were just being laid. The scale of the enterprise was staggering, a project that would consume years, even decades of labor. Here, the spiritual met the physical in the most direct way possible. The vow of obedience meant swinging a pickaxe to quarry stone or hauling massive blocks on wooden sledges under the supervision of master masons. The vow of poverty was embodied in the shared, back-breaking effort, where a knight's blistered hands were no different from those of a sergeant or a hired craftsman. This was the order's architectural legacy in the making, and he was not just a passive resident of these fortresses. He was an active participant in their very creation, his own labor woven into their formidable walls. The castles they built, like the legendary Chateau Pellerin at Atlet or the mighty fortress of Tortosa, were far more than simple military garrisons. They were marvels of medieval engineering, designed to be virtually impregnable and entirely self-sufficient. A brother assigned to such a project received a masterclass in defensive architecture. He learned why walls were built impossibly thick, often over 15 feet wide, to withstand the bombardment of siege engines. He understood the clever geometry of concentric design, where an outer wall, studded with formidable towers, protected a higher, even stronger inner wall, forcing any attacker who breached the first line to enter a deadly killing ground exposed to fire from all sides. He helped construct towering, square and later rounded keeps that offered commanding views of the surrounding countryside, and massive gatehouses protected by murder holes and multiple portcullises. But the true genius of these structures lay not just in their defiance of enemies, but in their mastery of the environment. In the arid climate of the Holy Land, water was more precious than gold, and a central part of the construction involved carving enormous, vaulted cisterns deep into the bedrock beneath the courtyards. These sophisticated systems collected every precious drop of rainwater from stone channels and gutters, creating reserves that could sustain a garrison of hundreds through a long siege. The castle was not just a shield, it was a life support system, a testament to an understanding that true strength required both military might and meticulous logistical planning. Within these formidable defensive shells, these stone sentinels blossomed into vibrant, self-contained communities, miniature cities dedicated to the Order's dual mission. A new brother would witness the complex ecosystem taking shape around him. Beyond the barracks and armories, there were extensive storerooms and granaries, stocked with supplies shipped from Europe or exacted as tribute from the surrounding lands, ensuring the community could withstand years of isolation if necessary. There were stables for hundreds of horses, workshops where blacksmiths, carpenters, and fletchers practiced their trades, and bakeries with massive ovens capable of producing bread for the entire garrison. At the spiritual heart of the complex stood the chapel, often a beautiful and surprisingly elegant structure despite the martial surroundings, where the brothers observed their daily hours of prayer, a constant reminder of the divine purpose that animated the entire enterprise. Perhaps most tellingly, many of these major commanderies housed a scriptorium, a room set aside for reading, study, and the meticulous copying of manuscripts. The presence of a library within a fortress speaks volumes about the Templar identity. It was a declaration that they were not mere brutes. They were a literate, organized institution that valued knowledge, record-keeping, and the preservation of their own history and rule. The castle was thus a physical manifestation of their entire worldview, a fusion of the monastic and the military, the practical and the pious, all contained within an unbreachable shell of stone. For the individual recruit, contributing to this monumental effort provided a profound sense of purpose that was both immediate and eternal. The daily routine of prayer and labor took on a powerful new dimension. The chant of the Psalms at dawn was followed by the rhythmic clang of hammers on chisels. The disciplined formation drills on the training ground were mirrored by the coordinated teamwork needed to lift a massive lintel into place over a gate. There was a tangible, deeply satisfying progression to the work. He could stand back at the end of a long month and see a wall that had risen several feet, a tower that now dominated the skyline, a cistern that was beginning to hold water. This was a legacy he could see and touch, unlike the fleeting chaos of a battle whose outcomes could be reversed by the next day's skirmish. The construction of a castle was a permanent alteration of the landscape. He was not just passing through the Holy Land, he was putting down roots made of granite and limestone, creating a permanent foothold for Christianity in a contested realm. This work forged a unique connection between the man and the monument. Years later, as a veteran knight garrisoned within the completed fortress, he could point to a specific section of the wall and remember the season he spent helping to build it. The castle became an extension of his own commitment, a part of his soul rendered in stone. In this way, the very act of building was elevated into a form of worship, a devotional practice as meaningful as any prayer. The meticulous care taken in squaring a stone, the patience required to mix and lay strong mortar, the collective effort to raise a towering wall, all of these were exercises in the same virtues the order championed: patience, discipline, humility, and obedience. The master mason's blueprint was followed with the same unwavering faith as the commander's order on the battlefield. Constructing a bulwark for the faith was a continuous, active prayer for its protection and perpetuation. These castles were more than strategic assets, they were theological statements. Their immense, enduring presence on the horizon was a constant, silent sermon declaring the resilience and permanence of the Christian presence in the East. They were symbols of an unshakable faith, quite literally built to withstand the storms of history. For the Templar recruit, his hands calloused from the stone and his faith fortified by the daily act of creation, the rising fortress was a testament to his own transformation. He was not only building a castle, he was building a new identity, one that would long outlive him, standing for centuries as a silent chronicle of the oath-bound journey he and his brothers had undertaken. For a new Templar brother, the sight of a black mantle bearing a stark white cross was as familiar as his own white one. These were the Knights Hospitaller, the other great military order born from the needs of the Holy Land, and their relationship with the Templars was one of the most defining and paradoxical features of his new world. It was a connection that defied simple labels, a perpetual dance of friction and alliance that taught him his first, crucial lessons in the complex realpolitik of Outremer. He quickly learned that the clear-cut division between brother and enemy, so easily understood on the battlefield against foreign armies, became blurred and nuanced when dealing with these fellow warrior monks. They were at once his staunchest allies in moments of existential crisis and his most formidable competitors in the relentless struggle for resources and influence. This intricate dynamic was not a footnote in his education. It was a core part of his training, forcing him to navigate a reality where spiritual brothers could be temporal rivals, and where the survival of the entire Crusader project sometimes depended on their ability to set aside deep-seated animosity and unite under a single banner. The roots of this rivalry were planted firmly in the fertile ground of European patronage. Both orders depended entirely on a continuous flow of donations from the pious back home, gifts of land, lucrative trading rights, and chests of silver coin. A new Templar recruit, perhaps assigned to assist a senior brother in managing the order's affairs in a bustling port like Acre, would witness this competition firsthand. He would see Hospitaller officials at the docks, overseeing the unloading of their own ships laden with supplies. their presence a constant reminder that every rich merchant or visiting nobleman was a potential patron being courted by both orders. The stakes were astronomical. A major donation to the Hospitallers could mean they could afford to build a new fortress or equip an entire squadron of additional knights, enhancing their prestige and military power at the direct expense of the Templars. This created an atmosphere of intense, often unspoken, rivalry in the corridors of power and in the counting houses. It was a race for spiritual capital that had very earthly consequences, and every brother understood that the Order's ability to sustain its mission hinged on its success in this endless, quiet contest for the hearts and wallets of Christendom. This competition for resources naturally bled into the political arena, where the two orders often championed starkly different strategic visions. The Templars, with their original mandate to protect pilgrims, often favored a more aggressive forward defense posture, focusing on controlling key roads and building castles in militarily strategic, if sometimes economically barren, locations. The Hospitallers, true to their origins in caring for the sick and poor, sometimes pursued a strategy that prioritized consolidating territory and managing their vast network of hospitals and estates. A young Templar knight might find himself listening intently as his commander explained why they were opposing a Hospitaller-backed proposal for a truce with a local Muslim emir. The Templars might argue that the truce was strategically naive, giving the enemy time to regroup, while the Hospitallers could counter that it was a necessary respite to rebuild the region's shattered economy and tend to the civilian population. For the recruit, it was a masterclass in strategic thinking. He learned that there was rarely one single Christian position. There were only competing interpretations of how best to achieve a shared holy goal. He had to learn to respect the intelligence and piety of his Hospitaller counterparts, even as he vehemently disagreed with their counsel, understanding that their rivalry was not born of malice, but from a genuine, if divergent, commitment to the same cause. Yet, when the war horn sounded and the dust of an advancing enemy army appeared on the horizon, this entrenched rivalry would vanish in an instant. The defense of a Crusader city like Antioch or the sacred city of Jerusalem itself was a cause that transcended all institutional pride. In these moments of existential threat, the Templars and Hospitallers demonstrated a level of professional cooperation that was the envy of the often disunited secular Crusader armies. A Templar sergeant holding the line on the ramparts would feel a surge of relief to see the distinctive black mantles of the Hospitallers marching in good order to reinforce a buckling section of the wall. On the battlefield, their shared discipline, their common language of drill and command, and their identical commitment to a higher purpose allowed them to function as a single, cohesive force. A Templar cavalry charge would be expertly supported by Hospitaller crossbowmen providing covering fire. A Hospitaller field hospital, set up behind the lines, would treat wounded Templar brothers with the same care as their own. In the heat of combat, the color of the cross on the mantle became irrelevant. What mattered was the shared identity as dedicated warriors fighting for the survival of their world. This battlefield camaraderie, forged in shared sacrifice and mutual reliance, created a powerful, unspoken bond that somehow coexisted with the bitter rivalries in times of peace. This constant oscillation between competition and collaboration was the ultimate education in the practical realities of power. It taught the young Templar that the world was not black and white, but a spectrum of shifting grays. He learned the vital skill of compartmentalization, how to fiercely oppose the Hospitallers in a council chamber over a matter of policy, and then, mere days later, trust them with his life in a desperate battle against a common foe. This was not hypocrisy, it was a sophisticated understanding of context. It taught him that loyalty could be layered. His primary allegiance was without question to the temple. But he also held a secondary, broader allegiance to the entire Christian enterprise in the Holy Land, and that sometimes required subordinating his order's immediate interests to the greater good. He learned when to stand his ground in a dispute and when to concede for the sake of unity. These interactions with the Hospitallers, more than any lecture from his superiors, revealed the true meaning of realpolitik. It was the art of balancing ideals with necessities, of knowing that purity of purpose had to be tempered by pragmatic alliances. For a man who had taken vows of absolute poverty, chastity, and obedience, this lesson in navigating the messy, contradictory world of human institutions was perhaps the most complex and revealing part of his entire oath-bound journey. Within the formidable stone walls of the Templar commandery, the new knight quickly learned that his white mantle did not place him at the summit of a solitary peak, but rather situated him within a complex and interdependent ecosystem. While the knightly brothers were the most visible face of the order, its day-to-day survival and spiritual cohesion depended entirely on two other crucial groups, the sergeants and the chaplains. This threefold structure was not a simple hierarchy of importance, but a delicate balance of function, each role essential to the holy machine. For a young recruit from a noble background, accustomed to a social order where birthright dictated status, this was his first continuous lesson in a new kind of humility. He was surrounded by men who would never be called brother knight, yet upon whose skill, labor, and spiritual guidance his own effectiveness and salvation directly depended. The commandery was a living classroom in practical theology, demonstrating that every task, from wielding a sword to mending a saddle to hearing a confession, was a form of divine service when offered with a pure heart and a dedicated will. The sergeants formed the robust, practical backbone of the entire Templar operation. These were men who had taken the same core vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they came from non-noble stock, the class of free men, skilled craftsmen, and experienced men-at-arms. A knight did not have to look far to find them. They were everywhere, their black or brown mantles bearing the distinctive red cross a constant presence. In the stables, it was the sergeant brothers who possessed the deep, intuitive knowledge of equine medicine and training, caring for the powerful destriers that were the key to the Templar cavalry charge. On the march, these same men would be the ones ensuring the pack animals were properly loaded, that the supply wagons were in good repair, and that the column maintained its discipline. In the workshops, sergeants with years of experience as blacksmiths, carpenters, or armorers would be patiently teaching a newly sworn knight, perhaps for the first time in his life, how to properly mend a broken link in his own chainmail or resole his own worn-out boots. This was a profound inversion of the secular world's norms. The noble-born knight, who had always had servants and retainers to maintain his gear, was now expected to learn these vital, hands-on skills from men he would have previously considered his social inferiors. This daily interaction was a deliberate and powerful antidote to the sin of pride, grounding the knight in the gritty reality that his lofty status was meaningless if the practical foundations of the community crumbled. This reliance became even more starkly evident on the battlefield, where the distinction between knight and sergeant blurred in the face of shared danger. The sergeants fought as men-at-arms, often forming the solid core of the infantry screen that protected the knight's horses or holding the defensive line of a castle wall. A knight charging into the fray did so with the absolute confidence that the sergeant archers and crossbowmen were providing suppressing fire from the flanks, and that if he were unhorsed, it would be a sergeant who would fight his way through the chaos to bring him a remount. Their role was not one of subservience but of professional partnership. They were the steady, reliable foundation upon which the shock power of the knightly charge was built. A recruit learned through experience that the grizzled, veteran sergeant who had survived a dozen campaigns knew more about the ebb and flow of a skirmish than any green knight fresh from the training grounds. He learned to listen to their advice, to respect their hard-won judgment, and to understand that courage and devotion were not the exclusive domain of the aristocracy. The brotherhood, in its truest sense, was demonstrated in this mutual dependence under fire, where a man's worth was measured not by his lineage, but by his steadfastness in the line of battle and his loyalty to the brother standing beside him, regardless of the color of his mantle. If the sergeants cared for the body and the material needs of the order, the chaplains were the dedicated physicians of the soul. These were ordained priests, the only members of the Templar community permitted to celebrate Mass and hear confessions. Their presence was a constant reminder of the order's primary identity as a religious institution. For a knight recruit grappling with the immense psychological and moral weight of his new life, the chaplain was an indispensable guide. The rule strictly forbade the brothers from confessing their sins to any outside priest, ensuring that the unique spiritual challenges of the warrior monk were understood by the confessor. A young man tormented by doubts after his first kill, or struggling with the loneliness imposed by his vow of chastity, could unburden himself to the chaplain, who provided not just absolution, but counsel framed within the specific context of their sacred, violent calling. The chaplain was the keeper of the order's conscience, the one who could reassure a troubled brother that defending the innocent was an act of charity, and that the disciplined violence of their duty, when performed with the right intention, was not a sin but a sanctioned offering to God. The chaplain's influence permeated the daily rhythm of the commandery. It was he who led the relentless cycle of the canonical hours, from the pre-dawn mystery of matins to the quiet closing prayers of compline. His voice, reading from scripture or from the order's own rule during the silent meals in the refectory, was a constant thread of spiritual instruction weaving through the day's labor. He was the guardian of the order's liturgical life, ensuring that the sacred rituals were performed with precision and reverence, providing the spiritual fuel that powered the entire enterprise. Before a mission, it was the chaplain who celebrated the Mass, blessing the brothers and their weapons, transforming their impending combat from a mere military operation into a sacred undertaking. And in the terrible aftermath of battle, it was the chaplain who moved among the wounded and the dying, offering last rites and the final comfort of God's grace, performing one of the most solemn and compassionate duties of their harsh world. The knight learned to see the chaplain not as a remote figure of authority, but as an integral part of his spiritual survival, a necessary compass in a landscape often devoid of moral clarity. Together, this three-tiered structure of knights, sergeants, and chaplains created a self-sufficient microcosm, a holy society in miniature that mirrored the three estates of the medieval world outside its walls: those who fought, those who worked, and those who prayed. But the Templar model refined this ancient structure, purging it of the worldly ambitions and internal conflicts that often plagued secular society. Here, all three estates were harnessed to a single, transcendent purpose. There was no competition for land or temporal power between them. A sergeant's well-forged sword and a chaplain's well-delivered absolution were understood to be of equal value in the grand endeavor. This system taught the knight recruit a profound lesson in systemic humility. He was a crucial component, the sharp tip of the spear, but the spear itself was useless without the strong shaft crafted by the sergeants and the guiding hand of the faith provided by the chaplains. His journey to spiritual and martial excellence was not a solitary quest, but a path walked in constant company with these dedicated men. He learned that true strength for the order and for himself lay not in isolated prowess, but in the harmonious, humble integration of the warrior, the artisan, and the priest, each playing their God-ordained part in the divine symphony of their shared mission. This profound psychological shift did not happen overnight, nor was it a single dramatic event. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible erosion of the self, a rewiring of the mind achieved through the relentless, daily machinery of the Templar life. Imagine the inner world of a young knight, raised in a culture that celebrated individual honor, personal lineage, and the pursuit of glory. Every element of his new existence was now meticulously designed to attack those very foundations. The vow of poverty stripped him of the possessions that defined his social standing. The vow of chastity severed the emotional ties that connected him to a personal future. The vow of obedience systematically dismantled his capacity for independent judgment. Day after day, week after week, the constant cycle of prayer, labor, and training acted like water dripping on stone, slowly wearing away the contours of his old identity. He was no longer Robert of Champagne, son of a minor lord, with dreams of winning a lady's favor or acquiring a small fiefdom. Those personal narratives, once the core of his being, began to feel like stories about a stranger. The space they occupied was gradually filled by a new, singular story, the story of the Order. His thoughts, which once revolved around personal advancement or romantic longing, now became preoccupied with the integrity of the formation, the needs of his brothers, and the success of the mission. This was not a loss of personality in the sense of becoming an empty shell, but a fundamental reorientation of consciousness where the I was steadily replaced by the we. The most powerful tool in this transformation was the white mantle itself. Initially, it was a piece of clothing, a uniform denoting his new status, but over time it evolved into something far more potent, a second skin, a psychological exoskeleton that dictated his every action and thought. When he donned the mantle each morning, he was not just getting dressed, he was assuming a role, stepping into a symbolic identity that carried the weight of 2 decades of legend and sacrifice. The stark white wool was a constant physical reminder of the purity he was sworn to embody. It was conspicuously clean in a world of dust and grime, making him instantly recognizable to pilgrims as a protector and to enemies as a target. This visibility was crucial. He could not have a moment of selfish anger in a market square or show a flash of cowardice on the road without it reflecting not just on him, but on the entire temple. The mantle forced a state of perpetual self-awareness and self-control. He began to make decisions not based on what Robert wanted, but on what a Templar should do. The symbol started to dictate the reality of his behavior. He was no longer a man wearing a symbol. He was the symbol incarnate, a living, breathing representation of an ideal. His personal desires became subsumed by the imperative to uphold what the White Cross stood for: discipline, faith, and unwavering resolve. This internal shift fundamentally altered his experience of fear and courage. In his former life, courage might have been a burst of adrenaline, a passionate response to a threat, often mixed with the desire for personal glory. The Templar concept of courage was something entirely different. It was a cold, calculated, and enduring state of mind. He was trained to control the physiological rush of fear, to acknowledge its presence without allowing it to dictate his actions. On the battlefield, this looked like the ability to hold a cavalry line, waiting for the perfect moment to charge despite the hail of arrows, trusting the command of a superior over the screaming instinct to flee or attack prematurely. This was not the absence of fear, but a mastery over it, a discipline born from countless hours of drill and the profound trust that his brothers would hold the line with him. His life was no longer his own private possession to be guarded at all costs. It was a resource belonging to the order, to be spent wisely and obediently in the fulfillment of their duty. This perspective liberated him from the paralyzing anxiety of self-preservation. The question shifted from, "How can I survive this?" to, "How can my actions best serve the mission and protect my brothers?" This reframing turned potential terror into focused determination, making him a more formidable and reliable warrior than any mercenary fighting for pay or any feudal knight fighting for personal honor. Ultimately, this psychological journey aimed to create what the Order's founders might have considered the perfect instrument of divine will. The ultimate goal was to forge a man whose individual ego had been so thoroughly integrated into the collective purpose that his own will and God's will, as expressed through the Order's command, became one and the same. He was not meant to be a mindless automaton, but a conscious, willing, and highly skilled agent of a cause he believed was transcendent. His thoughts were focused on tactical problems and spiritual devotion, not personal gain. His emotions were channeled into loyalty for his brothers and compassion for the pilgrims they protected, rather than romantic entanglements or personal vendettas. His very sense of self was redefined. He found his identity not in what he owned or who his ancestors were, but in the sacred function he performed within the divine machinery of the Order. This mental fortitude, this unshakable core of disciplined purpose, was indeed their most powerful weapon. It was what allowed a handful of men to defend castles against overwhelming odds, to undertake seemingly suicidal missions, and to maintain their cohesion in the face of political betrayal and military disaster. A sword can be broken, a shield can be shattered, but this psychological armor, forged in the crucible of communal discipline and spiritual devotion, was nearly impervious. The man had become a symbol, and in that transformation he achieved a form of resilience that was not just military, but existential, enabling him to face the chaos of the world with a calm, unwavering center that no external force could ever truly breach. The written word can only take us so far into the world of the first Templar recruits. While official chronicles detail their battles and papal bulls outline their rule, the intimate, human texture of their daily existence often escapes the formal script of medieval scribes. To truly hear their story, we must learn to listen to a different kind of testimony, one written not in ink on parchment, but in stone, in metal, and in the silent spaces of their abandoned chapels. The most poignant chronicles of these oath-bound men were never penned by a human hand. They were lived, worn, and left behind, waiting for us to decipher their quiet, material language. It is through the patient work of archaeology and the careful study of art that we can bridge the centuries and touch the reality of their lives, moving beyond the grand narratives of crusade and conspiracy to the simple, powerful truths of a mended piece of chainmail or the worn stone of a prayer niche. Consider the humble yet eloquent testimony of a single piece of armor. In the ruins of a Templar commandery, archaeologists might uncover a section of chainmail, its thousands of interlocking iron rings still clinging together after centuries buried in the earth. But it's not the object itself that tells the full story, it's the specific marks it bears. Upon close inspection, you might find a section where the rings are of a slightly different size or metal, a careful, skillful repair. This patch woven into the fabric of the mail speaks volumes. It tells us that this armor was not disposable, but a precious asset, maintained with thrift and care in accordance with the vow of poverty. It whispers of a brother, perhaps a sergeant with a talent for metalwork, sitting by torchlight, painstakingly linking new rings to replace those shattered in a skirmish or rusted by the sea air. This mundane act of maintenance connects us directly to the daily, practical reality of their existence, the understanding that their survival and the survival of their brothers depended on the diligent upkeep of the tools of their trade. The repaired mail is a testament to a culture of discipline and resourcefulness, a quiet rebuke to any image of the Templars as merely wealthy and profligate. The architectural footprints of their commanderies and castles offer another profound, non-verbal narrative. Step inside one of their characteristic round churches, like the Temple Church in London, and you are immediately enveloped by a different atmosphere than that of a long, soaring Gothic cathedral. The circular design, inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a theological and experiential one. The circular layout created a continuous, unbroken space, symbolizing the eternity of God and the unity of the brotherhood. There were no long naves leading to a distant altar, creating a hierarchy of space. Instead, the brothers gathered around the center, a physical manifestation of their shared equality before God. The very stones of these chapels, cool and imposing, tell a story of a spirituality that was communal, focused, and inward-looking. Similarly, the stark, functional design of their rural commanderies in Europe, with their thick walls, large barns, and simple dormitories, speaks of a life dedicated to utility and defense. The architecture refuses to boast, it simply endures, mirroring the character of the men who lived within its walls. There are no frivolous carvings or grand halls built for entertainment, only spaces designed for prayer, labor, and the logistical support of a holy war being waged thousands of miles away. While the Templars themselves were often forbidden from personal adornment, the artifacts left behind by those they served provide a unique window into their world. The discovery of a pilgrim's badge, a small, inexpensive lead or tin alloy token, in the soil of a Templar commandery is a find of immense significance. These badges were sold to pilgrims at holy sites as souvenirs and proofs of their journey. Finding one in a Templar context is a tangible link to their core mission. It is physical evidence of the pilgrims they protected, a silent echo of the grateful traveler who passed through their gates, perhaps receiving food, shelter, or safe conduct from the brothers. This small, discarded object connects the abstract vow to protect pilgrims with a real, individual human life. It grounds their entire purpose in a single, relatable artifact, reminding us that the Templars' journey was inextricably intertwined with the spiritual journeys of countless ordinary people whose paths they were sworn to safeguard. Illuminated manuscripts, though often created by outside artists, provide invaluable visual clues that written records omit. In the margins of a chronicle or within a religious text, we might find a depiction of two Templar knights sharing a single horse, an image that has become iconic. This was not merely a stylistic choice, it directly illustrates the order's early poverty, as described in their own rule. These images confirm the austerity of their beginnings, showing them not as the later banking power, but as a humble brotherhood making do with limited means. Other manuscripts show them in battle, their equipment and banner, the famous beauseant rendered in careful detail. From these illustrations, we can discern the types of helmets they wore, the shape of their shields, and the way they wielded their lances. They offer a frozen moment in time, a visual corroboration of the military discipline we read about, showing them fighting in tight, coordinated units rather than as individual heroes. These are not photographs, but they are the next best thing, contemporary interpretations that help us visualize the stark reality behind the legend, giving flesh and blood, steel and cloth to the historical abstraction. Perhaps the most moving artifacts are those that speak to the individual behind the uniform. In some excavations, personal items of startling simplicity are found. A worn gaming piece, perhaps used during a rare moment of respite, a simple eating knife, a bone comb, these objects are powerful precisely because of their mundanity. They are not the stuff of legend or treasure hunts. They are the quiet possessions of a man who, despite his profound vows, remained a human being with a need for basic hygiene, sustenance, and simple distraction. They remind us that the Templar recruit was not a faceless drone in a religious army, but an individual who once sat with his brothers, maybe sharing a laugh over a game or carefully combing his hair before a morning prayer service. These small, personal effects are the antithesis of the grand conspiracy theories. They ground the Templar story in a relatable humanity, connecting us across the centuries to the simple, everyday moments that made up a life of extraordinary commitment. Each one is a silent witness, a fragment of a story that official documents ignore, telling us that even within the rigid structure of the order, there were still small spaces for the small, human things that make a life whole. From the very beginning, the brilliant white of their mantles seemed to cast a long, dark shadow. For a new Templar brother, the pride of wearing the cross was almost immediately tempered by a more complicated reality, the quiet realization that beyond the walls of the commandery, the world watched them not only with admiration but with a deep and growing suspicion. Their rapid ascent from a small band of idealists to a powerful, transnational institution with vast lands and papal protection was nothing short of miraculous, and in the medieval mind, miracles and magic were often two sides of the same coin. People began to whisper, how could a group of warriors sworn to poverty amass such wealth? What truly happened behind the closed doors of their chapter meetings, from which all outsiders were barred? The very secrecy that was essential to their internal cohesion and military security became fertile ground for the wildest of imaginations to take root. For a recruit, this meant that his sacred oath was not just a private commitment, but a public statement that would be scrutinized, questioned, and often maliciously misinterpreted by the very society he had pledged to protect. These rumors took many forms, each targeting a different aspect of their unique identity. Some of the earliest and most persistent whispers concerned their spiritual practices. The fact that their initiation rites were conducted in secret was a red flag to many. In an age where communal religious celebration was the norm, a ceremony hidden from view was inherently suspect. Outsiders, including fellow clergy, began to speculate about what blasphemous acts or denials of Christ might be required to join this elite club. Their close contact with the Muslim world for diplomacy and intelligence, a necessity for survival in the Holy Land, was another source of suspicion. To a pious but ignorant observer in Europe, a Templar brother negotiating a truce with a Muslim emir might easily be misconstrued as consorting with the enemy or, worse, being seduced by Islamic beliefs. The complex, pragmatic reality of Outremer's politics was lost in translation, replaced by a simplistic narrative of betrayal. Even their discipline was twisted into something sinister. Their refusal to engage in the boisterous, often drunken feasting of secular nights was seen not as piety, but as arrogance or secrecy. Their quiet meals, taken in silence while listening to scripture, were somehow proof that they were hiding something, that their communal life was a front for a darker truth. For the individual knight, this barrage of suspicion was a constant, low-grade irritation that could quickly flare into a direct confrontation. A group of brothers traveling through a European village on order business might be met with averted eyes and hushed conversations rather than cheers. In a tavern, the conversation might suddenly die when they entered. They might overhear snippets of conversation from local knights, jealous of their privileges and independence, accusing them of cowardice for avoiding tournaments or of greed for managing their estates so effectively. A new recruit, still solidifying his own understanding of the order's purpose, would have to learn to swallow his pride and hold his tongue. Reacting with anger to an insult would only confirm the accusations of pride and arrogance. He had to embody the discipline he professed, turning the other cheek not out of weakness, but out of a steadfast confidence in the righteousness of his path. This required a psychological resilience that went beyond the battlefield. It was a daily exercise in humility and faith, a test of his commitment not to the approval of the crowd, but to the silent judgment of his own conscience and his brothers. This relentless external pressure had a profound and perhaps unintended consequence, forging the internal bonds of the brotherhood into something even stronger and more unbreakable. When the outside world seems to misunderstand and malign you, you naturally turn inward for validation and support. The commandery became more than just a headquarters. It became a sanctuary, a fortress of shared understanding in a sea of suspicion. The very rumors meant to divide them instead solidified their unity. The secret rituals that outsiders found so threatening became for the brothers a sacred trust, a shared experience that set them apart and bound them together. The whispered accusations of heresy only reinforced their need to prove their orthodoxy to themselves and to God through even greater acts of devotion and sacrifice. This cultivated an us-against-the-world mentality that was incredibly powerful. The trust between brothers became absolute because they were the only ones who truly knew what their lives were about. They were a band of initiates united by a truth that the uninitiated could never comprehend. This solidarity was a source of immense strength, allowing them to face not only military enemies but also the more insidious attacks on their character and faith. Living under this cloud of potential heresy became an unspoken but ever-present part of the Templar burden. It was a spiritual trial that ran parallel to their physical ones. A brother might be praying in the chapel, seeking solace, while knowing that just beyond the walls, people were questioning the very nature of his prayers. He could be risking his life to clear a road of bandits, only to be accused of being in league with them. This created a unique form of psychological strain, a feeling of being perpetually misjudged. His faith was no longer a simple matter between himself and God. It was a public performance under a microscope where any misstep could be twisted into evidence of corruption. This constant scrutiny forced a level of self-examination and doctrinal purity that was perhaps more intense than in any other contemporary religious order. They had to be above reproach, not because they were inherently saintly, but because they knew their every action was being watched by critics eager for them to fail. This shadow, cast so early in their history, was a grim foreshadowing of the storm to come. The vague suspicions and jealous rumors of the 12th century would, over time, crystallize into the specific, damning accusations used by a French king to destroy them in the 14th. For the first recruits, it was merely a test of their resolve, but it set a tragic precedent, establishing a narrative of secrecy and unorthodoxy that would ultimately prove far more dangerous to the order than any army they ever faced on the fields of the Holy Land. Consider for a moment the sheer improbability of what that first generation accomplished. They were not inheriting a prestigious institution, they were building one from the ground up, with little more than a radical idea and an unshakable conviction. The template they forged in those early, precarious years was not drafted on parchment in a quiet scriptorium. It was hammered out on the anvil of daily necessity in the harsh light of the Holy Land. Their most enduring legacy was this foundational culture, a unique alloy of austere piety and ruthless martial efficiency that proved to be astonishingly resilient. This was not a loose set of guidelines, but a complete operating system for a new kind of human institution. The unwavering discipline born from their threefold vow created a social cohesion that was virtually unheard of in the feudal armies of their time, where personal glory and individual honor often trumped collective action. Their ability to act as a single, unified entity on the battlefield, to maintain formation under terrifying pressure, and to execute complex maneuvers with silent precision, all stemmed from this initial cultural blueprint. They demonstrated that the highest levels of military effectiveness could be achieved not through the whip of a tyrant, but through the internalized discipline of a shared spiritual purpose. This culture became the Order's immune system, allowing it to survive military defeats, political setbacks, and the constant attrition of campaigning, remaining a coherent and potent force for generation after generation. Their innovative approach to warfare became another cornerstone of their lasting influence, fundamentally altering the way military operations could be conducted. Before the Templars, medieval combat often devolved into a chaotic series of individual duels once the lines met. The first Templar recruits, under the leadership of visionaries like Hugh de Payens, institutionalized the concept of the disciplined collective charge. They turned the cavalry charge from a thrilling but often disorganized rush into a surgical instrument of shock and awe. By training to move and strike as a single, cohesive unit, they could deliver a concentrated impact that could shatter enemy formations that vastly outnumbered them. This was a tactical revolution. Furthermore, their understanding of logistics and finance, born from the practical need to sustain their operations across vast distances, transformed them from a mere fighting force into a self-sustaining military enterprise. They created a trans-Mediterranean network for moving men, material, and money with a reliability that kings and emperors could only envy. This financial acumen ensured they were never as desperate for funds as the perpetually cash-strapped Crusader states, giving them a crucial degree of independence and staying power. The first generation proved that an army needed a robust economic engine just as much as it needed brave soldiers, establishing a model of military professionalism that would not be seen again for centuries. Yet, perhaps their most powerful legacy was not written in their battle records or their account books, but in the mythos they created. They took the seemingly contradictory ideals of the monk and the knight, two figures that stood at opposite ends of the medieval social and spiritual spectrum, and fused them into a single, compelling archetype, the warrior monk. This was a figure of immense symbolic power. In a single person, he embodied the self-denial and piety of the cloister and the courage and martial prowess of the battlefield. He was a walking paradox, a man who could kill yet remain at peace with God, who owned nothing yet commanded vast resources, who had renounced all personal will yet wielded immense collective power. This archetype captured the imagination of all Christendom. It resolved a deep tension in the medieval Christian mind about the morality of violence, offering a path where the sword could be sanctified. The white mantle, therefore, became more than a uniform. It was a symbol of this perfected hybrid, a banner of pure intention draped over a formidable fighting machine. The first generation did not just create an efficient military order. They created a legend, a story about the possibility of transcending human contradictions to achieve a higher state of being. This mythos was so potent that it began to generate its own gravity, attracting recruits, donations, and a level of awe that far exceeded their tangible achievements. This powerful foundation allowed the Templar system to scale from a handful of knights in Jerusalem to a vast international network with properties stretching from Scotland to the Holy Land. The culture, tactics, and financial models established by the pioneers proved to be remarkably transferable and adaptable. A new commandery established in a remote part of England or France would operate on the exact same principles as the headquarters in Jerusalem. The same daily horarium of prayer, the same military drills, the same strict hierarchy, and the same vows were replicated everywhere. This created a consistent institutional identity that was immune to the regional loyalties and cultural differences that often fractured other organizations. A Templar from Aragon and a Templar from Normandy, when they met in the East, were not foreigners to each other. They were brothers united by a shared system and a common purpose. The template was so robust that it could absorb men from dozens of different cultures and languages and remold them into a homogeneous and predictable component of the order. This scalability was the key to their longevity and their geopolitical influence, turning them into the world's first truly multinational corporation. And it was all made possible by the clarity and strength of the original design implemented by the first recruits. Ultimately, the legacy of these first men is a testament to the power of a defining culture. The order they built survived for nearly 200 years, not simply because of its military might or its wealth, but because the cultural DNA implanted at its inception was so strong. It taught subsequent generations how to be Templars, how to navigate the tension between poverty and power, between prayer and combat, between individual conscience and collective obedience. This culture ensured that the order remained recognizably itself through centuries of change, through shifts in papal policy, through the rise and fall of Crusader kingdoms, and through the constant evolution of warfare. When the order was finally destroyed in the early 14th century, it was not brought down by a military defeat on the field of battle. It was dismantled by a cynical political attack from a king who coveted its wealth and feared its power. But even in its destruction, the legacy of the first generation proved unkillable. The legend they created, the mythos of the pure, disciplined, and mysterious warrior monk, was too powerful to be erased by mere royal decree. It escaped the confines of history and leaped into the realm of folklore and fantasy. The template they established for discipline, dedication, and the fusion of spiritual and worldly power continues to echo, a ghostly blueprint for an ideal that was once made real in the hearts and actions of those first few men who dared to believe that a knight could also be a monk, and in doing so, they built something that proved to be far greater than the sum of its parts. It is a remarkable testament to the power of their foundational ideals that the core principles which animated those first Templar brothers nearly 9 centuries ago feel so strikingly relevant in our modern world. We live in an age often characterized by digital distraction, fleeting commitments, and a culture that sometimes prizes individual expression above collective purpose. Yet in this landscape, the timeless pillars of the Templar ethos, unyielding discipline, a clear and compelling purpose, profound brotherhood, and selfless service continue to resonate with a quiet, persistent power. We may not be called to take up the sword and shield in a dusty land, but the human yearning for a life of significance, for a cause that demands our very best, and for a community that offers unwavering loyalty, remains as potent as ever. The story of these first recruits is far more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror held up to our own deepest questions about who we are and what we are willing to build our lives upon. One of the most direct and powerful modern parallels can be found in the world of elite military units, particularly special forces. The journey of a Navy SEAL or a Green Beret through their infamous training pipelines is a modern-day echo of the Templars' rigorous selection and transformation. Just as a medieval aspirant was broken down and rebuilt in the commandery, so too is a special forces candidate subjected to relentless physical and psychological trials designed to weed out all but the most committed. The focus is not on creating the most spectacular individual fighter, but on forging a member of a team. They drill for countless hours in small unit tactics, learning to move, communicate, and fight as a single, cohesive organism, their individual identities subsumed into the effectiveness of the squad. This mirrors the Templar practice of formation fighting, where the synchronized charge of a knightly squadron was more valued than any single act of heroism. Both groups share that profound, almost spiritual sense of mission. For the Templar, it was the protection of pilgrims and the defense of the Holy Land. For a modern special operator, it might be a high-stakes counter-terrorism operation or a hostage rescue. In both cases, the mission is paramount, and it is a purpose that justifies immense personal sacrifice, hardship, and risk. The white mantle of the Templar and the trident pin of the seal are both symbols of an identity earned through extreme hardship and dedicated to a cause far larger than the self. Beyond the battlefield, the Templar search for meaning beyond material accumulation speaks directly to a central anxiety of our contemporary existence. In a society saturated with consumerism and the constant pressure to acquire more, a bigger home, a newer car, a more prestigious job, the Templar vow of radical poverty feels like a shocking, almost revolutionary counter-narrative. They demonstrated that true freedom could be found not in the accumulation of possessions, but in their deliberate renunciation. This is not to suggest we should all give away our worldly goods, but their example challenges the underlying assumption that more stuff leads to more happiness. We see modern echoes of this in the minimalist movement, where people consciously choose to live with less, finding that a life decluttered of excess belongings is often richer in time, relationships, and experiences. We see it in the growing number of professionals who leave high-paying, high-stress careers to pursue work that, while perhaps less lucrative, offers a greater sense of purpose and contribution. The Templar path reminds us that the most fulfilling treasures are not those that can be stored in a vault, but those that are built in the heart and shared with a community, the treasure of purpose, the wealth of camaraderie, and the currency of service. This leads us directly to the Templar ideal of brotherhood, a concept that can feel increasingly rare in our digitally connected yet often personally isolated world. The Brotherhood of the Temple was not a casual friendship or a social network. It was an all-encompassing bond forged in shared hardship, mutual dependence, and a sacred oath. They ate, prayed, trained, and slept together, their lives so deeply intertwined that the success and survival of one depended entirely on the others. In our modern context, we yearn for this depth of connection. We find approximations of it in the intense camaraderie of a tightly knit sports team striving for a championship, in the unbreakable bonds formed among firefighters in a busy station house, or in the supportive, almost familial environment of a small startup company where everyone is invested in a common dream. These groups offer a glimpse of that Templar-like unity, where individual egos are set aside for the good of the team, and where loyalty is not a mere sentiment but a daily, active practice. The Templar model shows us that this level of community doesn't happen by accident. It is intentionally built through shared rituals, common goals, and a culture that values the group as much as the individual. Ultimately, the most challenging question their story poses to us today is about the nature of our own commitments. The first Templar recruits did not sign a short-term contract. They took an oath that was meant to bind them for life. In an era of quiet quitting, gig economies, and a general skepticism toward institutions, the idea of such absolute dedication can seem alien, even frightening. Yet their example asks us to reflect on what, if anything, we would be willing to dedicate ourselves to so completely. Is it a person, a creative pursuit, a scientific goal, a social or environmental cause? The power of their journey lies not in prescribing a specific answer, but in validating the profound human need to find something, an idea, a community, a mission, that is worthy of our wholehearted devotion. Their lives stand as a powerful argument that while a life of minimal commitment may be safe, a life of deep, meaningful commitment is where we often discover our true strength and identity. They traded the uncertainty of a self-directed life for the clarity of a purpose-driven one, and in doing so, they built a legacy that has endured for centuries. Their chronicles, therefore, are not just a record of the past, but an ongoing invitation to consider the oaths we ourselves are prepared to take, spoken or unspoken, and the causes we choose to serve with the brief and precious time we are given. The legendary status of the Templars has, over the centuries, become a canvas for our wildest imaginations, painting over the gritty, historical truth with layers of glittering myth and shadowy conspiracy. It's a captivating narrative, to be sure, the idea of these white-clad knights as guardians of the Holy Grail, possessors of the Ark of the Covenant, or keepers of a secret bloodline of Christ. These stories speak to a deep human desire for mystery and hidden knowledge, but they fundamentally obscure the far more remarkable reality of the first Templar recruits. The true treasure these men guarded was not a golden chalice or a set of ancient scrolls. It was something both more mundane and more profound, their unwavering faith and their revolutionary operational capability. Their power did not spring from occult secrets whispered in dark crypts, but from the brilliantly practical and utterly transparent combination of disciplined military force and a sophisticated financial network that functioned with the efficiency of a modern corporation. To see them only through the lens of fantasy is to do a great disservice to their actual human achievement. Consider the pervasive myth of their legendary wealth and hidden relics. The image of the Templars as fabulously rich treasure hunters is a dramatic distortion of their core vow of individual poverty. The immense economic power the order wielded was always collective, never personal. A Templar brother owned nothing. The treasure that flowed through their commanderies was not gold coins piled high in a secret vault for their own enrichment, but the working capital of a vast, non-profit enterprise dedicated to funding a holy war. Those resources paid for ships to transport war horses from Europe, for tons of grain to feed garrisons, for iron to be forged into swords and arrowheads, and for stone to build the formidable castles that guarded the pilgrim routes. Their real treasure was their logistical genius, their ability to move men and material across thousands of miles of sea and land, ensuring that a brother knight on the frontiers of the Holy Land had the tools he needed to perform his duty. This was a treasure of organization and diligence, not of plundered relics. There is not a single piece of credible historical evidence from their own extensive records or from contemporary chroniclers that suggests they ever discovered or sought the Holy Grail or any other such artifact. Their entire focus was on the pressing, earthly mission of protection, not on archaeological quests for holy objects. The allure of secret knowledge is another seductive fiction that has attached itself to the Templar name. Their initiation ceremonies were indeed conducted in private, a necessity for any elite military and religious group to maintain internal discipline and screen for genuine commitment. This necessary secrecy, however, became a blank screen onto which outsiders projected their own fears and fantasies. The idea that they were heretics, practicing strange rituals or worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet, largely emerged from the confessions extracted under brutal torture during their suppression in the early 14th century. For the first recruits, their secret knowledge was not esoteric but practical and spiritual. It was the knowledge of how to care for a warhorse on a long desert march, the silent hand signals used to coordinate a cavalry charge, the intricate prayers of the monastic hours, and the complex theology that justified their unique vocation as warrior monks. This was the knowledge that mattered to them, the know-how of survival, service, and salvation. Their power stemmed from this mastery of the visible world, not from a grasp of the occult. Ultimately, the fictionalized Templar is often a solitary, brooding figure, a lone knight on a secret quest. This could not be further from the historical truth. The entire might of the Templars was their unity. Their strength was the collective, the unbreakable wall of shields, and the synchronized thunder of the charge. A recruit's journey was not about cultivating his individual power or uncovering personal secrets. It was about the systematic dismantling of his ego and his seamless integration into a larger whole. The real Templar story is one of community, not conspiracy. It is a story of men who chose a life of incredible hardship, not for personal gain or hidden knowledge, but for a shared ideal they believed was greater than themselves. This true narrative of sacrifice, discipline, and brotherhood is, in the end, far more compelling than any shadowy legend. It is a story not of superhuman guardians of magic artifacts, but of flawed, courageous, and deeply committed men who built something extraordinary through sheer force of will and faith. By letting go of the myths and embracing the documented facts of their recruitment, their grueling training, and their austere daily lives, we do not diminish them. Instead, we honor the genuine, profound sacrifice of their oath-bound journeys, recognizing that the real legacy of the Templars is not buried in a hidden vault, but written plainly in the pages of history, in the stark ruins of their castles, and in the timeless human ideals of purpose and commitment they so powerfully embodied. For a Templar brother, the moment of death was not a failure or a tragedy in the conventional sense, but rather the ultimate and final act of obedience, the complete fulfillment of the promise he had made on that long-ago initiation night. In a life defined by the constant proximity to violent ends, whether from disease, accident, or the sword, the Order provided a clear and comforting theological framework for this inevitable passage. They viewed death not as a terrifying void, but as a release, a transitus, or crossing over from the arduous earthly toil of their mission to the eternal reward promised for their faithful service. This perspective was a crucial piece of their psychological armor. A knight riding into a skirmish could face the very real possibility of his own end with a calmness that baffled his secular counterparts, not because he did not value his life, but because he saw its conclusion as a return to the God he had served with every fiber of his being. His death, if it came in the line of duty, was the final, perfect offering of the life he had already surrendered. The rituals that followed a brother's passing were a direct reflection of the Order's core monastic values, carrying the same stark simplicity and solemn dignity that had characterized his daily existence. There were no grand processions, no ornate coffins, and no eulogies praising his personal deeds or lineage. The body of the deceased was carefully washed and prepared by his brothers, an act of final service and respect. He was then clothed in the full Templar habit, his simple tunic and the iconic white mantle, now serving as his shroud. This was profoundly symbolic. He had entered the Order with the bestowal of this mantle, and he would leave the world wearing it, a clear statement that his identity as a brother of the Temple was the only identity that mattered in the end. He was buried without any personal effects or grave goods. No sword was laid beside him, no family heirloom, no coin for a mythological ferryman. This strict adherence to the vow of poverty extended even into the grave, reinforcing that he owned nothing in life and took nothing with him in death. His only possession was his faith, and his only hope was in the grace of God. The burial itself typically took place in a consecrated cemetery within the commandery's grounds or in a nearby churchyard under the Order's control. These were not public spectacles but private, somber affairs attended only by his brothers. The grave was a simple one, often marked only by a plain stone cross, perhaps carved with the emblem of the Order, but never elaborating on the individual's name or achievements. This anonymity in death was the final, powerful lesson in humility. In the Templar Brotherhood, no one man was greater than the whole. The celebrated hero of a dozen battles and the quiet brother who had spent his years mending armor in the workshop were laid to rest in exactly the same manner, their equality in death testifying to their shared commitment and their equal value in the eyes of the Order and of God. The physical body was returned to the earth with minimal fuss. A temporary vessel that had housed a soul now returned to its creator. Yet, while the body was committed to the ground with simple rites, the community's duty to the deceased brother was considered perpetual. His name was meticulously recorded in the Order's necrology, a sacred roll of the dead kept at the commandery. This was not merely an administrative record, it was a spiritual contract. On the anniversary of his death each year, the community would gather for a special mass offered for the repose of his soul. His name would be read aloud in the chapter, and his brothers would pray for his swift passage through purgatory and into the eternal light of heaven. This practice created a powerful, living connection between the brothers still on earth and those who had gone before them. It was a tangible expression of a brotherhood that transcended the grave. A young recruit, hearing the names of the fallen read during a service, understood that he was part of a continuum, a chain of devotion that stretched back to the first founders and would continue long after he was gone. His own name would one day be added to that list, ensuring he would never be forgotten by the fraternity he had served. This perpetual prayer was the Order's final promise to its members, a promise of eternal remembrance and spiritual support. This approach to mortality provided a profound sense of closure and meaning for the brothers left behind. The grief they felt for a fallen comrade was real and deeply personal. They mourned the loss of a friend, a training partner, a man whose face they saw every day at meal times and in the choir. But their mourning was not tinged with the despair of those who believe death is the final end. Instead, it was tempered by the firm conviction that their brother had successfully completed his journey. He had kept his oath to the very last breath. His struggles were over, his vows fulfilled, and his eternal reward assured. This belief transformed their grief into a solemn, almost reverent celebration of a life completed. It fortified the living, reminding them of the purpose and the promise that gave meaning to their own continued sacrifices. The funeral rites were not a farewell, but a "see you later," a temporary parting until the entire brotherhood, both living and dead, could be reunited in the presence of God. In this way, the Templar's final journey was the ultimate consolidation of his life's work, a seamless transition from a mortal soldier of Christ to an eternal citizen of heaven, his bond with his order unbroken and his place in its story permanently and lovingly secured. The chronicles of these first Templar recruits ultimately reveal a story far more profound than a simple military history. It is a testament to the extraordinary capacity for human transformation. These were not mythical figures sprung from the earth fully formed, but ordinary men of flesh and blood, grappling with doubt, fear, and ambition, who consciously chose an extraordinary path. Their journey from the solemn, candle-lit silence of their initiation night to the sun-scorched, blood-stained realities of the Holy Land was a continuous crucible. In this fire, the base metals of their former selves, their personal pride, their individual desires, their attachment to worldly status were systematically burned away, leaving behind a refined alloy of unwavering faith, iron discipline, and a brotherhood stronger than any family tie. This meticulous, often brutal process of remaking a man did not just create effective soldiers. It forged one of the most unique and formidable institutions the world has ever seen, a living paradox that was both a monastery and an army, answering to both the Pope and the desperate cries of pilgrims on a dangerous road. The true legacy they left us, therefore, stretches far beyond their legendary military might or their sophisticated financial network. While their castles still stand as broken teeth on the landscapes of the Middle East and Europe, their most enduring monument is intangible. It is the powerful idea that commitment to a cause greater than oneself can be the most potent source of identity and purpose a person can ever find. They demonstrated that the most profound freedom could be discovered not in the accumulation of possessions or the pursuit of personal glory, but in the willing surrender of those very things to a collective ideal. Their lives became a symphony played on a single instrument, the order itself, and in losing their individual melodies, they created a harmony of such power that it still echoes across the centuries. This is why the 12th century chronicler William of Tyre captured their essence so perfectly when he wrote, "They are indeed fearless and careful knights, truly religious men." He saw what made them exceptional. It was the fusion, the seamless blending of the careful, calculated courage of the warrior with the profound, unwavering devotion of the religious. They were fearless not because they did not feel fear, but because their faith was a stronger force. They were careful not out of timidity, but because their discipline was a form of worship. Let their story, now that we have walked a little way with them, become a mirror for your own. In our modern world, the concept of a lifelong, unbreakable oath can feel like a relic from a distant past. Our commitments are often fluid, our careers changeable, our allegiances shifting. Yet, the human need for purpose, for something to which we can dedicate our energy, our talent, and our passion, remains as vital as ever. The Templars challenge us to ask ourselves, what are the causes, the communities, or the principles that function as our own order? What are the unspoken oaths that guide your decisions, your commitment to your family, your dedication to your craft, your loyalty to your friends, or your pursuit of a truth you believe in? Their journey invites a quiet reflection on what we are truly willing to commit to, not for a week or a year, but with the kind of wholehearted dedication that can fundamentally reshape a life. They stand as a powerful reminder that while a life of scattered interests may be broad, a life of deep, focused commitment is where we often discover our true depth. If these uncharted chronicles of the first Templar recruits and their oath-bound journeys have captivated your imagination, if their story of transformation, sacrifice, and ultimate brotherhood has resonated with you, we would love to hear your reflections. What part of their journey did you find most compelling? How does their concept of purpose challenge or inspire your own? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation and build our own community of history enthusiasts. And if you want to join us for more deep dives into the heart of history, to uncover other forgotten stories and legendary figures, please subscribe to the channel. Our next journey into the past is just